40 Core Tenets of Western Civilization. Greek Rationalism and Philosophical Inquiry. Western civilization is deeply rooted in the spirit of rationalism pioneered by the ancient Greeks. This tenet is the reliance on human reason and logic to understand the world, rather than solely on myth or tradition. Greek philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in the classical period, 5th–4th centuries BCE, championed systematic questioning and the use of evidence and logical argument. They introduced formal logic and the idea that natural phenomena have natural causes that humans can discern through inquiry. This intellectual tradition placed a high value on critical thinking, laying the groundwork for science and secular philosophy in the West. In ancient Athens and other city-states, rational debate and philosophical schools flourished. Thinkers openly discussed ethics, politics, and the nature of the cosmos, establishing the Western habit of inquiring into first principles. Aristotle's works, for example, became core texts that later Western scholars studied for centuries. Unlike some cultures where knowledge was handed down as unquestionable, the Greeks encouraged debate. The Socratic method of dialogue and debate epitomizes this. Over time, Greek rationalism was preserved, often through Roman and later Islamic scholars, and reintroduced to Europe in the Middle Ages, then fully embraced during the Renaissance and Enlightenment. Thus, rational and scientific inquiry remained central in Western development, directly feeding into the scientific revolution much later. Contrasting non-Western perspectives. Other great civilizations certainly produced rich philosophies, but their approaches often differed. In ancient China, for instance, intellectual focus was on moral order and harmony, Confucianism, rather than abstract logic. Formal logic as a discipline never developed there in the way it did in Greece. Indian philosophy explored metaphysics and spirituality, e.g. Upanishads, Buddhism, more than empirical investigation of nature. Many cultures explained natural events through religion or myth, such as rain via rain gods, whereas Greeks like Thales or Aristotle sought physical explanations, e.g. Thales hypothesized water as the fundamental element. While Islamic scholars did engage with Greek rationalism and made scientific advances, their work eventually fell under stricter religious constraints, unlike the increasingly secular trajectory in the West. In more tribal societies, knowledge was transmitted through oral tradition and myth, without a formal practice of logical debate. The Greek idea that reason and evidence should be the final arbiters of truth is a distinctive legacy in the West, giving rise to Western science, secular education, and a persistent habit of questioning even long-held beliefs. This rationalist spirit also informed Western political thought. It was in questioning how humans best govern themselves that the seeds of another tenet were planted: democracy. Democracy and civic participation. Democracy, literally rule by the people, is a cornerstone of Western political heritage that first emerged in the city-states of ancient Greece. In 5th century BCE Athens, a radical idea took hold. Free male citizens, regardless of wealth or birth, could participate directly in governance. They assembled to debate and vote on laws and policy, practicing a form of direct democracy. This tenet emphasizes that government authority derives from the citizens, and that broad participation and debate are healthy for the community. Decisions were made through majority vote in the ecclesia, assembly, and public offices were often filled by lot or short terms to ensure rotation. The Athenian ideal praised the civic engagement of ordinary people. Pericles, the Athenian statesman, famously extolled democracy by saying, "Power was in the hands of the many, not the few." This early democracy was limited, excluding women, slaves, foreigners, and it eventually gave way to other forms of rule in Greece. However, its legacy profoundly influenced Western thought. The notion of citizens' participation reappeared in different guises. The Roman Republic had popular assemblies electing some officials, though power was more balanced with elites, Senex tenet, and medieval European towns sometimes had councils or guilds with elected leaders. In the modern era, Western civilization revived and expanded democracy. Thinkers of the Enlightenment lauded the Athenian example, and modern democracies built on its principles while adapting them. The United States, at its founding, and revolutionary France in 1789, explicitly drew on democratic ideals, establishing representative systems with elections. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, Western nations broadened voting rights to include all adult citizens and created robust institutions, parliaments, congresses, to represent the people. Thus, what began as a radical experiment in one Greek city became a defining model of governance in the West, representative democracy, where leaders are elected and accountable to the populace. Contrasting non-Western governance. Historically, most other civilizations did not develop democracy as early or in the same form. Large empires in Persia, China, or India were governed by monarchs or emperors with bureaucracy, not by citizen assemblies. Authority often came from divine sanction or hereditary right, rather than the consent of common people. In imperial China, for example, the emperor ruled as the Son of Heaven, and although there were local village elders or gentry councils, there was no national system of citizen voting. Likewise, pre-colonial India was ruled by kings or local princes. While some republic-like clans existed in ancient India, they were the exception and not as institutionally developed as Athens. In the Islamic world, governance historically vested in caliphs or sultans who might consult advisors, shura, but subjects generally did not have a formal role in legislating or choosing rulers. Some tribal societies had participatory elements. For instance, various indigenous peoples made decisions by council or consensus among warriors, but these were small-scale and based on kinship, not a codified system for a state. The sustained idea of citizens having a right and duty to shape their government remained uniquely robust in the Western lineage. Even today, many countries practice democracy, largely because these Western ideals set the template. The distinctiveness lies in how early and strongly the West embraced governance of the people, by the people, for the people, making democracy a core identity of Western political culture, Roman republicanism, and civic virtue. Alongside democracy, the Western tradition of republicanism, government by elected leaders under law, without a monarch, originates from ancient Rome. The Roman Republic, 509 to 27 BCE, was not a direct democracy like Athens, but a mixed system, with elements of aristocracy and popular rule. Power was divided among consuls, executive magistrates, the Senate, a council of elites, and popular assemblies that elected officials and passed some laws. This arrangement introduced the idea of checks and balances and the rule of law as higher than any individual leader. A key tenet here is civic virtue, the expectation that citizens, particularly the leaders and propertied classes in Rome's case, would actively serve their state with honor, putting the common good above personal interest. Roman civic culture highly valued duties, military service, voting in assemblies, and holding public office if called. The ideal Roman citizen was exemplified by legends like Cincinnatus, who, according to tradition, left his farm to serve as dictator in a crisis and, after victory, relinquished power and returned to humble life. Such stories instilled the Western ideal that political office is a temporary responsibility, not a means of personal enrichment. The Republic lasted nearly 5 centuries, and in that time Romans developed extensive legal codes, the 12 Tables, later the body of civil law, and concepts like veto, Latin for I forbid, used by tribunes to protect commoners. Even when the Republic gave way to the Empire, the memory of republican governance, a res publica or public affair belonging to the people, persisted in Western thought. Influence and development. Renaissance thinkers in Europe idolized the Roman Republic's virtues. States like the Florentine Republic or Venetian Republic looked back to Rome in structuring their governments. In the Enlightenment era, theorists, such as Montesquieu, praised the Roman model of mixed government and separation of powers. The founders of the United States deliberately drew from Roman republicanism. The U.S. Senate, for example, echoes the Roman Senate, and early American discourse referenced Cincinnatus and Roman law. Thus, republicanism, rule by laws and elected representatives, became a core Western tenet, blending with democracy in modern times. Most Western democracies are indeed republics or constitutional monarchies with republican principles. Contrasting non-Western forms. For most of history, hereditary monarchy or chiefdom was the norm globally. The Roman idea that political authority comes from citizenship and laws, rather than divine right, set Europe apart. In East Asia, no republican tradition took hold until the 20th century. Emperors ruled, and the concept of the state as a public trust shared by citizens was absent. In the Middle East, governance centered on dynastic rule, Ottoman Sultanate, for example, and religious authority, not elected representation. Some pre-colonial African and Amerindian societies had councils or elders governing, but these were often kin-based and lacked the formal legalism of a republic. The Western commitment to governing through impersonal laws and elected bodies, and valuing civic virtue like honesty, frugality, and patriotism among public servants, was a distinctive development. It instilled in Western political culture a skepticism of absolute power, and an ideal that government officials are custodians of the public interest. This is a lasting legacy seen in everything from the term limits on leaders to the impeachment processes that hold them accountable, all tracing back to Roman Republican principles that remain largely unique to the Western political evolution. The rule of law. Rule of law is a foundational Western concept asserting that law, rather than arbitrary power, governs a society. It means that everyone, from the average citizen to the highest leader, is subject to the same laws, and those laws are applied through established procedures. In Western civilization, this tenet took shape early and grew strong. From the Roman 12 Tables, the first codification of Roman law in 5th century BCE, making laws transparent to all citizens, to the principle in England that even kings must obey law, crystallized in the Magna Carta of 1215. The rule of law emphasizes justice, predictability, and accountability in governance. In practice, this manifested as Western societies developing detailed legal systems and institutions. Roman jurisprudence became highly advanced, introducing ideas like legal precedent, equity, and the notion that laws should be written and public. During the Middle Ages, the Church in the West also contributed by developing canon law and insisting on certain universal moral rules. Later, the Enlightenment era brought about refined legal codes, e.g., the Napoleonic Code of 1804 in France, which was a clear written body of civil law, and constitutional frameworks that enshrined rule of law. In modern Western states, an independent judiciary interprets and applies the law, and government actions can be checked by courts. People can only be punished based on laws and through fair trials, the concept of due process, not at a ruler's whim. This creates a culture where rights are secure, contracts are enforced, property is protected, and officials can be challenged legally if they overstep their authority. Contrasting law elsewhere, while many civilizations had law codes, the Code of Hammurabi in ancient Mesopotamia, for example, or Islamic Sharia law, the Western rule of law tradition is distinct in its secular and evolving nature and in subjecting rulers to the law. In imperial China, laws existed and were often comprehensive, the Tang and Qing legal codes, but the emperor was above the law as the ultimate authority. Law was a tool of governance rather than a constraint on the sovereign. Confucian ideology favored rule by moral example over rule by law, sometimes viewing too much legalism as a sign of moral decay. In many Islamic states historically, the ruler, caliph or sultan, was expected to uphold Sharia, yet in practice they wielded considerable arbitrary power, and certain groups did not have equal legal status. For instance, non-Muslims or women had different rights under traditional interpretations of Sharia. In feudal societies, including medieval Europe before evolving rule of law, legal rights depended on one's estate or lord, something Western civilization gradually reformed so that commoners and nobles came under one legal framework. Tribal justice systems often emphasize customary law and may treat members versus outsiders differently, lacking the universal application that Western rule of law ideal strives for. What makes the Western tenet notable is the ideal of legal equality and consistency. A medieval English king being compelled by barons to agree to Magna Carta, thus accepting that his will could be bounded by law, was a watershed not seen in other regions at that time. Over centuries, this evolved into modern constitutional law that can invalidate even a president's actions if unlawful. This Western insistence on law's supremacy has facilitated stable institutions, because people and investors trust that rules, not personal favoritism, generally prevail. It's a pillar of Western governance exported worldwide. Many countries' legal systems today are based on European civil law or English common law traditions. The Western rule of law is a distinctive approach that continues to differentiate societies in terms of corruption levels, governance, and individual rights protection. Monotheism and Judeo-Christian moral law. Western civilization's ethical and spiritual foundations are profoundly shaped by Judeo-Christian monotheism, the belief in one God, and the moral law derived from that belief. Ancient Hebrew religion introduced ethical monotheism, centered on a just, all-powerful God who lays down universal moral rules, as epitomized by the Ten Commandments. Christianity, emerging from that tradition and becoming the dominant faith of Europe by the early Middle Ages, reinforced and spread those concepts. This tenet includes the idea of a transcendent moral order. Right and wrong are defined by God and are the same for all people, everywhere. It brought notions like the sanctity of life, the importance of truthfulness, justice, mercy, and human equality before God. Historically, as the Roman Empire adopted Christianity, 4th century CE onward, Western lands transitioned from a myriad of pagan cults to a more unified Christian worldview. The Church became a central institution in the West, teaching that kings and peasants alike were accountable to God's law. Moral law from Judeo-Christian scripture, such as prohibitions on murder, theft, perjury, or adultery, was integrated into Western legal systems and social norms. Furthermore, the Christian message of compassion, love thy neighbor, care for the poor, infused Western values. This will be discussed more with the tenet of charity. Another crucial aspect was the linear view of history inherited from the Bible. Time has a beginning and moves toward a divine goal, which differed from cyclical notions of time elsewhere and encouraged a sense of purpose and progress. The idea of providence, divine guidance, also gave Western people confidence that history and morality had an underlying direction. Distinctiveness in context. Most ancient civilizations were polytheistic. Greeks and Romans worshipped many gods, as did Egyptians, Hindus, etc. Polytheistic religions often tied gods to specific communities or natural forces, and did not always emphasize a unified moral code applying to all humanity. The Judeo-Christian tradition, by contrast, posited one God for all humans and a morality that transcended tribal or national law. This was a profound shift. For example, in Homeric Greek culture, there wasn't a single moral law. Morality was more about heroism and honor relative to one's people. In India, dharma, righteous duty, was different for each caste and stage of life, a very plural moral order. Chinese traditional religion honored ancestors and multiple deities, and moral thinking was channeled through philosophy, Confucianism, rather than a single divine command applicable to all. In the Islamic world, which shares the same monotheistic roots, the concept of one God and moral law is present. Sharia law governs both religious and ethical duties. However, an interesting difference is how the West developed the idea of separating religious and secular spheres. More on that soon. Whereas Islam traditionally unified political and religious authority under one system, Western Christianity eventually allowed for a distinction between God's law and Caesar's law. The Judeo-Christian influence made individual conscience and universal moral accountability key Western ideas. A king could be rebuked by a prophet or a pope for violating God's law, e.g., medieval churchmen challenging unjust monarchs, implying that morality stands above rulers. A concept not common in many other cultures where the ruler was the source of law or seen as divine. It's distinctive that Western civilization's moral underpinnings include an assumption of moral absolutes and human dignity coming from a divine source. This has had lasting effects. Even as Western societies secularized, their commitments to human rights and inherent human worth echo those religious origins. In summary, the Western tenet of monotheism and biblical moral law set a common ethical baseline, don't kill, don't steal, value family, etc., and a sense of unity across different peoples under one God, which provided a powerful cohesive identity and value system very different from the polytheistic or local-centric religions elsewhere. Human dignity and the sanctity of life. Western civilization holds as fundamental the inherent dignity of each individual human life. This tenet, that every person has worth and rights simply by being human, grew out of Judeo-Christian teachings and later secular humanist philosophy. In Christianity, the idea that humans are made in the image of God imparted a sacredness to each life, whether rich or poor, king or commoner. The sanctity of life became a moral cornerstone. Acts like murder or infanticide were not just breaches of social contract, but sins against a divine value placed on each person. Over time, even as religious influence ebbed in some quarters, the secular Enlightenment adopted a similar stance in humanistic terms, e.g., Immanuel Kant's principle that humans must be treated as ends in themselves, not means to an end. Historically, this principle led Western societies to gradually extend protections and rights to more and more people. In the ancient Roman world, for example, not all lives were valued equally. Slaves or defeated enemies could be killed with little repercussion. But under Christian influence, practices like gladiatorial games, where lives were taken for sport, were abolished by the late Empire, and early medieval laws began to impose penalties for killing even slaves. The notion that even the lowliest person possessed a soul precious to God introduced an ethical restraint on violence and oppression. Moving into the modern era, Western thinkers framed this inherent dignity in secular language. "All men are created equal," wrote Thomas Jefferson in 1776, reflecting both the Christian idea of equality before God and the Enlightenment idea of natural equality. This laid groundwork for movements to abolish slavery, end torture and cruel punishments, and promote universal human rights. The Western-led creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, after World War II, is a direct outgrowth of this tenet, asserting that all members of the human family have equal and inalienable rights. Comparative perspective. Not all civilizations historically held such an egalitarian view of human worth. In caste-bound India, human value was tied to caste status. A Brahmin's life was implicitly worth more than an untouchable's in social practice. And early law codes, like the laws of Manu, prescribed different penalties depending on caste of victim and perpetrator. In many cultures, prisoners of war or slaves were seen as objects or property, not bearers of inviolable rights. For instance, pre-Columbian Americas saw practices like human sacrifice in Aztec culture, indicating a very different view of the sanctity of an individual life. Even in East Asia, the emphasis was on fulfilling one's role, filial piety, loyalty, rather than on intrinsic individual rights. If one stepped outside their role, their value diminished in society's eyes. The Greco-Roman world had the concept of natural law through Stoic philosophy, suggesting a kind of universal human dignity, which actually influenced Christian thought, but it remained more of an ideal than practice in antiquity. It was the fusion of Stoic universalism with Christian doctrine that gave Western civilization a unique drive to assert that all human beings deserve respect and protection. This leads to things we take for granted in the West: humanitarian aid to strangers, outrage over human rights abuses anywhere in the world, and legal systems based on equal personhood. While today many cultures embrace the language of human dignity, it was a distinctive moral leap within the West to put the weakest and strongest on the same moral plane. That tenet continues to guide Western policies, like opposition to the death penalty or euthanasia debates, often revolving around sanctity of life arguments, and underpins international human rights norms that, though global in aspiration, have Western pedigree. Charity and compassion. Another core tenet of Western civilization is an emphasis on compassion for the vulnerable and charitable action to help those in need. This largely stems from the Christian ethic of love thy neighbor and the example of the Good Samaritan, moral teachings that stress mercy, charity, and altruism. In Western history, this translated into a sustained tradition of organized charity and a cultural expectation to care for the poor, sick, and disadvantaged, which over time evolved into both private philanthropy and public social welfare systems. From late antiquity through the Middle Ages, the Christian Church was the main conduit for charity in Europe. Bishops and monastic orders established some of the first hospitals, orphanages, and poorhouses. Almsgiving was promoted as a virtue for the wealthy. It was common for medieval wills to leave money to feed the poor, or for religious confraternities to distribute food and clothing to the needy. Compassion was seen as a key personal virtue. The saints of Western tradition often exemplified caring for lepers, widows, and orphans, e.g., St. Francis of Assisi renouncing wealth to serve the poor. This religiously driven charity set Western culture apart in that it created institutions specifically to assist the less fortunate, rather than relying solely on family or clan support. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment, as secular thinking grew, the value of compassion remained. It simply became more humanistic. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau argued against cruelty and for empathy as part of natural human sentiment. By the 19th century, even as Western societies industrialized and secularized, they generated broad charitable movements, anti-slavery societies, seeing enslaved people suffering as morally unacceptable, Red Cross organizations, founded in Switzerland by Henry Dunant to care impartially for war wounded, and countless charities tackling poverty, illness, and education. Eventually, Western governments themselves enacted social welfare measures, pensions, unemployment aid, public health, as a form of institutionalized compassion, a concept at the heart of modern Western European states. Comparative outlook. Many cultures value kindness, but the Western way of institutionalizing charity has particular roots. In Islamic societies, charity, zakat, is indeed a pillar of faith. Devout Muslims are required to give a portion of their wealth to help the poor, and Waqf endowments historically funded schools and hospitals in the Islamic world. So charity is not uniquely Western. However, in some cases it was more internally focused, to one's community of believers, and not as globally directed as later Western humanitarianism, which often crosses cultural lines. In South Asian Hindu and Buddhist contexts, charity, dana, is encouraged. But the social stratification of caste sometimes limited empathy across caste lines. Help was often given within one's group, and the karma concept sometimes led to a view that one's misfortune had spiritual causes. Confucian East Asia emphasized filial piety and mutual aid within the family or clan, but had less of a concept of volunteering to help unrelated strangers in organized ways until modern influences arrived. Tribal societies typically rely on reciprocal sharing within the group. Generosity is valued, but usually toward kin or known members of the tribe, not abstract poor people in general. The Western scenario, where, for example, individuals might dedicate their life to serving a foreign people out of compassion, think of numerous Western missionaries, doctors, and aid workers abroad, reflects a more universalized view of compassion that grew from Christian teachings of universal neighborly love, later secularized as humanitarian principle. What stands out is how Western civilization progressively widened the scope of compassion, from caring for one's co-religionists in a parish to advocating for humanitarian treatment of all humans, even enemies or distant peoples. This tenet has driven global efforts like disaster relief, development aid, and human rights campaigns, many spearheaded or heavily funded by Western origin institutions. It also shapes domestic life. Western societies expect that the vulnerable, the poor, disabled, elderly, children should receive support, whether via private charity or public programs, as a moral imperative, not merely optional kindness. In sum, while compassion is a shared human virtue, Western civilization's distinctiveness lies in the extent to which it organized and universalized charity, making compassion a cultural norm and international endeavor. Separation of church and state. A defining feature of Western political development is the separation of religious and secular authority, commonly phrased as the separation of church and state. This tenet means that the institutions of governance, kings, parliaments, courts, operate independently of religious institutions, churches, clergy, and neither domain should completely control the other. The idea evolved over centuries in the West, creating a dynamic duality: two powers, one spiritual and one temporal. This was not the norm in most other civilizations, where political rulers often doubled as high priests or claimed divine status, or where religious law was the law of the land. The roots of this separation go back to antiquity, but were powerfully articulated in Christianity. Jesus is saying, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's," hinted at distinct spheres. In practice, early Christian communities were spiritually led by the church, while politically subject to the Roman state, two different authorities. After Christianity became the state religion of Rome, a sometimes tense partnership formed between emperors and church leaders. Fast forward to medieval Europe. The papacy, pope, and various monarchs often clashed over authority. The investiture controversy of the 11th century, for example, was a fight over who could appoint bishops, the pope, or secular kings. These conflicts established that each sphere had its own legitimacy. By the late Middle Ages, the concept of two swords, spiritual and temporal, was well recognized. The existence of an autonomous church that could discipline even kings, e.g., excommunication, meant rulers had to acknowledge a moral authority beyond themselves, and conversely, the church could not directly rule kingdoms without secular cooperation. Over time, especially after the Reformation splintered Christendom into multiple churches, Western states moved toward formalizing this separation. The Peace of Westphalia 1648 made state sovereignty, non-interference by church and state affairs, and vice versa, a cornerstone of the international order. Enlightenment thought then actively endorsed secular governance. For instance, the United States Constitution, 1787, and Bill of Rights, 1791, explicitly forbade establishment of a state religion, enshrining religious freedom and a secular state. France, after its revolution, also implemented laïcité, state secularism, reducing church influence on government. Thus, modern Western nations generally keep religious institutions separate from government functions. No state religion with coercive power, or if retained, it's largely ceremonial. Laws made by secular legislatures, and people free to practice faith or not without state imposition. Other civilizations approach. In contrast, many societies historically intertwined religion and state much more closely. In the Islamic world, the ideal was a caliphate, where the leader was both a political ruler and defender of the faith, implementing Sharia law. While in practice there were often separate ulama, scholars, influencing law, Islamic states did not conceive a wholly secular realm. Religious law was civil law. Even modern Middle Eastern countries wrestle with this, and some, like Saudi Arabia or Iran, still maintain no separation. The law is religious. In South Asia, kings were seen as guardians of Dharma. The caste system which governed social law was inseparable from Hindu religious doctrine. There wasn't a separate state law aside from religious law until modern reforms. In East Asia, rulers were often seen as having a semi-divine mandate. The Chinese emperor performed key religious rituals for the empire's harmony. Japanese emperors were considered descendants of sun goddess Amaterasu. There wasn't an independent religious institution to rival the state. Religion was part of the state apparatus. E.g., in China, Confucian ideology was the state ideology, and other religious practices were regulated by the state. Tribal societies frequently had spiritual leaders who were also political leaders. Shamans or chiefs combined roles, or the tribe's governance was deeply tied to their religious beliefs. Western civilization's church-state separation is thus quite distinctive. It created a fruitful tension that arguably allowed greater intellectual freedom. When religious authorities became too dogmatic, secular authorities or intellectuals could push back, and vice versa. It also laid the groundwork for religious tolerance. Once the state is not enforcing one faith, diverse beliefs can coexist, another Western tenet that followed. The independent development of secular law, like common law or civil law systems, parallel to canon law, also meant Western legal systems could adapt to societal needs, even as religious morals were given due respect in the cultural sphere. Over time, this separation became a hallmark of modern democracy and pluralism. Western countries mostly view it as healthy that church leaders do not govern the state, and that political leaders do not dictate theology. This model has been adopted in many parts of the world now, but its historical origin and strongest realization is in the West. The phrase freedom of religion implicitly contains freedom from a state-imposed religion, a principle born of this unique Western journey of separating the sacred and secular realms. The university tradition and education. Western civilization was the birthplace of the university, an institution of higher learning that is self-governing and devoted to the pursuit of knowledge. The establishment of universities in medieval Europe marked a turning point in intellectual history and reflects a broader Western tenet, a deep commitment to education as a societal value, and the idea that learning, including secular subjects, should be systematically cultivated and passed on. The Western university tradition has persisted for over 900 years, evolving into the modern global model for higher education. The first true universities, often cited, are Bologna, founded approximately 1088, Paris, Sorbonne, and Oxford in the late 11th and 12th centuries, emerged out of cathedral and monastic schools. What made them unique was their structure: communities of scholars, masters, and students, chartered by papal or royal authority, but largely autonomous in setting curriculum and granting degrees. They taught the quadrivium and trivium, classical liberal arts including grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, and advanced subjects like law, medicine, and theology. Crucially, they fostered a spirit of scholastic inquiry, reasoned debate was encouraged, and even theology was studied with an analytic approach, e.g., Thomas Aquinas, using Aristotle's logic to examine Christian doctrine. This formalization of learning in a continuous institution was not present in other parts of the world in the same way. It allowed the accumulation and expansion of knowledge across generations and created an educated class not solely defined by noble birth or religious role, but by scholarly achievement. As the centuries went on, Western Europe's commitment to education only grew. The Renaissance brought an expansion of subjects. Humanities like history, classical languages, and the scientific revolution saw universities becoming hubs of scientific research, e.g., Galileo taught at Padua. By the 18th–19th centuries, universities had proliferated across Europe and the Americas, and public education systems for basic education were also established, many inspired by Enlightenment ideals and industrial needs. Western nations were among the first to strive for mass literacy and widespread schooling, as discussed later in the context of mass education. The university model, degrees like bachelor, master, doctorate, faculties, a curriculum mixing general and specialized knowledge, was exported worldwide in the age of imperialism and continues as the global standard. Comparison: other civilizations certainly valued learning, but their approaches differed. In Islamic civilization, higher learning took place in madrasas, which were often attached to mosques. They produced great scholars, especially in theology, law, and sometimes science in earlier eras. But their curriculum was heavily focused on religious sciences with some inclusion of philosophy or medicine. They did not evolve into independent multidisciplinary institutions to the extent of universities, though places like Al-Azhar in Cairo were similar in longevity. In China, education was oriented toward the imperial examination system. They had state academies to prepare scholar officials in Confucian classics. While this system produced a highly educated bureaucratic elite and is arguably a meritocratic educational model, it was narrowly focused on Confucian texts and government service rather than broad inquiry. There was no equivalent of the Western university, where various fields were explored for knowledge's sake independent of the state. In India, learning was traditionally done in gurukulas, teachers' homes, or monasteries like Nalanda, a Buddhist center. Nalanda, ancient university in Bihar, ca. 5th century CE, was actually a notable exception with diverse studies, but it didn't have the pan-societal impact or continuity that European universities did. Much of Indian traditional education was also tied to religious or vocational training within castes. Tribal societies relied on oral tradition for education, without formal schools beyond initiation teachings. The Western idea that education is an institution that stands somewhat apart from both church and state, though often supported by them, and that knowledge from many sources, ancient, foreign, empirical, should be synthesized and taught, is unique. It created a class of intellectuals and a culture of debate and innovation that pushed Western science, law, and humanities forward. Moreover, over time, Western nations made basic education a right for all children, something that became global only in the 20th century. The university tradition thus symbolizes Western dedication to knowledge and reason. Its impact can be seen today. The world's top universities, whether in the West or elsewhere, still operate on principles first established in medieval Europe. This tenet has given the West a continuous intellectual ferment and the capacity to advance in arts and sciences, feeding the overall progress of the civilization. Renaissance humanism. The Renaissance was a cultural movement in Europe, 14th–16th centuries, that gave rise to humanism, a tenet placing humans rather than divine or supernatural matters at the center of attention. Renaissance humanism revived interest in the classical learning of ancient Greece and Rome, and emphasized the potential value and goodness of human beings. It encouraged a focus on worldly life, education in the liberal arts, and the development of individual talent. This represented a shift from the medieval mindset that was predominantly God-centered to a more human-centered perspective, though it did not reject religion so much as broaden the scope of what was worthy of study and celebration. Humanists like Petrarch in Italy scoured monastic libraries for Latin and Greek manuscripts and promoted the study of studia humanitatis, grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy. They believed that studying the wisdom of the ancients could enlighten contemporary society and that humans could shape their own lives through learning and virtue. One famous humanist, Pico della Mirandola, wrote about the dignity of man, asserting that humans occupy a unique position in creation with the freedom to become what they will. This optimistic view of human potential was a hallmark of the Renaissance. Artists, funded by patrons like the Medici, depicted the human form with unprecedented realism and emotion. Think of Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical studies, or Michelangelo's celebration of the human body on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. In literature, figures like Shakespeare, though slightly later and in England, emphasized individual characters' depth and agency, a legacy of humanist influence reaching beyond Italy. The humanist tenet also meant a greater emphasis on secular subjects alongside theology. Universities added or expanded studies in law, medicine, and classical philosophy. Political thought, as seen in Machiavelli's writings, began to analyze statecraft in realistic human terms rather than purely moral or religious terms. Education reformers like Vittorino da Feltre established schools that taught both physical and mental disciplines, aiming to develop well-rounded individuals. This was the birth of the Western liberal arts education ideal, fostering eloquence, ethical understanding, and critical thinking, all focused on human society and this worldly outcomes. How it contrasts. In the same period, other parts of the world did not experience such a pronounced rebirth of classical learning or a turn toward human-centered art and scholarship. The Islamic world had a previous golden age, 8th-12th centuries, of science and philosophy. But by the 15th century, it had become more conservative. There was nothing directly analogous to the Renaissance's burst of artistic and humanistic exploration. The focus remained more on traditional religious learning in places like the Ottoman or Safavid realms. China under the Ming dynasty had vibrant culture, but it largely looked inward and reinforced Confucian orthodoxy. The Ming did produce great novels and porcelains, but their educated elite were still focused on Confucian civil service exams, not revisiting earlier Chinese classics in a transformative way. They already continuously studied their classics. There wasn't a conscious revival of a different ancient tradition because Chinese classical tradition had never been lost. The Renaissance in Europe was unique in that Europeans recovered a lost heritage, pagan Greece/Rome, and used it to refresh and challenge the medieval status quo. In India, arts and literature thrived under various kingdoms, but again, no equivalent movement placed human at the philosophical center. Literature often remained religious or courtly. The idea of probing old texts to cultivate a new secular outlook was distinctive to the Western Renaissance. Renaissance humanism is distinctive for how it gradually secularized Western culture. It laid an intellectual foundation for the Enlightenment and modern science by prioritizing reason and evidence, inspired by classical models, and by dignifying worldly endeavors such as art, exploration, and scientific inquiry. Other cultures certainly created magnificent art and literature, but Western humanists' conscious ideology, that studying humanity and this life is key to progress, was a novel direction. It changed Western civilization's trajectory, contributing to the end of the medieval era and heralding the modern age. The legacy is seen in Western art's human focus, in the celebration of individual achievement, Renaissance men like Da Vinci skilled in many fields, and in the very notion of human rights, which much later would draw from the idea of inherent human dignity that humanists championed against the view of people as merely souls awaiting heaven. Thus, Renaissance humanism stands as a core Western tenet, highlighting the worth of human experience and agency, distinguishing Western cultural evolution from contemporaneous developments elsewhere. Exploration and global expansion. Western civilization has a pronounced legacy of exploration. The drive to discover, map, and ultimately connect or conquer far-flung parts of the world. This tenet, often called the Age of Discovery, began in the 15th century when European sailors, motivated by curiosity, trade interests, missionary zeal, and competition, set out across the oceans. The result was unprecedented global expansion. Europeans were the first to circumnavigate the Earth and establish intercontinental maritime trade and colonial empires. The spirit behind this was a mix of adventurous curiosity and ambition, a willingness to take great risks to achieve discovery, wealth, and fame. Key milestones include Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492 across the Atlantic, which led to European awareness of the American continents, and Vasco da Gama's journey in 1498 around Africa to reach India, opening direct sea trade with Asia. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, 1519 to 1522, achieved the first circumnavigation of the globe. These explorers, backed by Western maritime powers like Portugal, Spain, and later England, France, and the Netherlands, knit together a globe-spanning network of navigation routes. Westerners mapped the world's coasts, studied global wind and current patterns, trade winds, monsoons, and developed new navigation techniques, like improved cartography, the marine compass, astrolabe, later sextant, to facilitate long-distance sea travel. This exploration tenet led to colonialism, which is a complex and often dark chapter. Europeans established colonies in the Americas, parts of Africa and Asia, drastically affecting indigenous populations. While morally fraught, it undeniably spread Western institutions, religion, notably Christianity via missionaries, languages, and technology worldwide, making Western civilization a global force. The mindset driving expansion was partly economic, search for gold, spices, and new trade routes to bypass middlemen, partly religious, the desire to spread Christianity as seen in the missionary efforts accompanying explorers, and partly the sheer intellectual intrigue of discovering unknown lands, illustrated by the detailed travelogues and reports of explorers like Marco Polo earlier, and later by James Cook or Alexander von Humboldt, who combined exploration with scientific observation. There was also intense national competition in Europe which fueled exploration. For example, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, dividing new territories, and later England and France competed for dominance in North America and Asia. That competitive drive is itself a Western trait, as discussed in another tenet, that propelled sustained exploration. Contrast with other cultures. Non-Western civilizations undertook exploration, but none sustained a global expansion in the same manner. China famously sent Admiral Zheng He on massive expeditions in the early 1400s, reaching Southeast Asia, India, and East Africa with enormous treasure ships. However, these voyages were halted by the Ming emperors after 1430s due to high costs and shifting priorities. China then largely turned inward and did not attempt to colonize lands across the seas. Polynesian peoples navigated the vast Pacific and settled many islands well before Europeans, reaching Hawaii, New Zealand, etc., showing remarkable seafaring skill. But this was prehistoric exploration not connected to Eurasian civilizations and had plateaued by the time Europeans arrived. Islamic traders and travelers, like the Arab navigator Ahmad ibn Majid or the Moroccan explorer Ibn Battuta in the 14th century, certainly journeyed widely by land and sea, and Muslim merchants had a presence across the Indian Ocean and even reached China. Yet, these travels, while extensive, did not lead Islamic powers to mount systematic voyages of discovery beyond known realms or to colonize new continents, perhaps because the Indian Ocean trade network was already lucrative and known, and Atlantic exploration didn't occur from their side. Indian and African kingdoms generally did not pursue long-range exploration outside their regions. Though there were coastal trading networks, they didn't launch explorations across oceans. Thus, when Columbus discovered the New World, it wasn't that others couldn't have, but Western culture uniquely had the combination of nautical technology, geopolitical drive, and ideological ambition at that historical moment to do so and follow through. The Western tenet of exploration changed the world's connectivity. It led to the Columbian Exchange, swapping crops, animals, and technologies between old and new worlds, with profound impacts like potatoes and maize feeding Europe, horses and wheat going to America. It allowed Western powers to dominate global oceans for centuries, a crucial factor in their economic and military supremacy. Culturally, it expanded Western horizons immeasurably. Europe learned of countless new peoples, plants, geographies, which in turn spurred intellectual movements. The science of geography, anthropology, etc., often began with colonial encounters. While other cultures certainly traveled and traded, none before had mounted such a concerted exploration of the entire globe. That wanderlust and willingness to venture into the unknown is a celebrated part of Western lore: voyages of Columbus, Cook's Pacific explorations, polar expeditions. It set Western civilization on a path to be the first truly global civilization, influencing and absorbing influences from all corners of the world. This exploratory zeal is a hallmark that Western civilization proudly claims, albeit with the recognition of its mixed consequences. The Reformation and freedom of conscience. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century was a seismic religious movement in Western Europe that led to the fragmentation of Western Christianity and the birth of Protestant churches. Its broader significance as a civilizational tenet lies in how it championed the freedom of individual conscience and challenged established authority. The Reformation asserted that individuals had the right, even the duty, to question religious doctrine and interpret scriptures for themselves, rather than unquestioningly accept a centralized church's teachings. This valorization of personal conscience and direct relationship with God profoundly influenced Western notions of individual freedom, literacy, and religious pluralism. It began in 1517 when Martin Luther, a German monk, protested against certain practices of the Catholic Church, most famously the sale of indulgences. Luther's act of nailing his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg is symbolic of an individual taking a principled stand based on conscience and scripture. What followed was a wave of reformers: John Calvin in Geneva, Huldrych Zwingli in Zurich, and others across Europe, who broke from Rome's authority and created new denominations. One of Luther's core tenets was the priesthood of all believers, meaning every believer could directly approach God through faith and scripture without priestly mediation. To facilitate this, reformers translated the Bible into vernacular languages. Luther himself translated the Bible into German. Suddenly, lay people were encouraged to read and interpret the holy text themselves. This democratization of religious knowledge had huge effects. It spurred widespread literacy. People learned to read so they could engage with the Bible, and it empowered individuals to form their own religious convictions. In essence, it nurtured the idea that conscience, guided by personal understanding of God's Word, is sovereign for each person. The societal upheaval of the Reformation was immense. It led to religious wars and persecutions, but ultimately, Western Europe had to come to terms with religious diversity. After generations of conflict between Catholics and Protestants, a degree of religious tolerance slowly emerged. E.g., the Peace of Augsburg 1555 allowed German princes to choose Catholicism or Lutheranism. The Edict of Nantes, 1598, granted limited tolerance to French Protestants, though later revoked. And much later, the Enlightenment and laws in various countries institutionalized freedom of religion. The Reformation thus set in motion the notion that the state should not coerce religious belief, a revolutionary concept at the time, and that individuals must be free to follow their conscience in matters of faith. This directly feeds the Western concept of religious liberty and the separation of church and state previously discussed. Beyond religion, a comparative view. The explicit idea of questioning religious authority and branching into multiple sects did not occur similarly in most other civilizations. In the Islamic world, for example, there were no movements equivalent to the Protestant Reformation that successfully created new independent branches of Islam recognized by the state. The Sunni-Shia split was much earlier and differently motivated, and later attempts at reform, like various internal revivalist movements, generally did not yield permanent pluralization in the way Protestantism did against Catholicism. Apostasy, leaving the faith, remained culturally and legally taboo or forbidden in Islam, whereas Luther and others effectively committed apostasy from Rome's perspective, yet won large followings and legitimacy for their new churches. In Eastern Christianity, Orthodox lands, there was also no Reformation. The religion remained relatively uniform and closely tied to state, e.g., Russian czars heading the church. In South Asia, challenges to religious orthodoxy occurred. The Bhakti movement, Sikhism's emergence blending elements of Hinduism and Islam, but these did not transform the overall structure of religious authority in society to the same extent, and often met with suppression or remained minorities. The Western Reformation's success was aided by unique factors. The printing press. New media technology spread ideas rapidly in the West, political rulers seeing advantage in breaking from the church, and the already established conceptual split between church and state that gave reformers some breathing space if they gained a prince's protection, like Luther did under Frederick the Wise. The Reformation is distinctly Western, in that it sanctified individual judgment. It made "Here I stand, I can do no other" attributed to Luther, a heroic stance, elevating fidelity to one's personal understanding of truth over obedience to authority. This attitude permeated Western culture beyond religion. It encouraged critical inquiry. Questioning even religious dogma paved the way for questioning secular authorities too. And it fostered pluralism. Different communities chose different interpretations, which Western society eventually had to accommodate. It's no coincidence that countries influenced by Protestantism early, like England, Holland, parts of Germany and Scandinavia, were among the first to embrace broader liberties like free speech and press, because the principle that no human authority can throttle conscience was embedded in their religious experience. The Reformation thus significantly contributed to Western civilization's notions of individual freedom, diversity of thought, and the importance of personal responsibility in matters of truth. Scientific inquiry and the scientific revolution. Western civilization is unique in having initiated the scientific revolution, a profound transformation in understanding the natural world that unfolded in the 16th and 17th centuries. This tenet is characterized by the application of empirical observation, experimentation, and mathematical reasoning to uncover the laws of nature, coupled with a willingness to challenge traditional authorities and beliefs about the cosmos. The result was the birth of modern science as a sustained enterprise, which drastically expanded human knowledge and technological power. Key figures illustrate this Western revolution and inquiry. Nicholas Copernicus, 1543, proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, defying the long-held geocentric view. Galileo Galilei, in the early 1600s, improved the telescope, observed the moons of Jupiter and the phases of Venus, and championed experimental physics, like studying motion by rolling balls down inclined planes. Johannes Kepler discovered mathematical laws of planetary motion, and Isaac Newton, 1687, crowned the revolution with his Principia Mathematica, articulating the laws of gravity and motion that unified the heavens and earth under the same principles. Underlying these breakthroughs was a distinctly Western approach, reliance on the scientific method, formulating hypotheses, testing them against evidence, and using reason to draw conclusions, all while sharing findings in a community of scholars for verification. Institutions like the Royal Society of London, founded 1660, epitomized this new approach, where scientists openly published experiments and argued over results, fostering a collective progression of knowledge. This scientific spirit was actually foreshadowed by medieval scholastics, like Roger Bacon or William of Ockham, who advocated empirical reasoning, but it truly took off in the Renaissance/Enlightenment context. Several factors helped it flourish in the West. The legacy of Greek rationalism. As discussed, Western thinkers inherited Aristotle, but also learned to question him. The presence of universities, which provided a home for natural philosophy, and the patronage of science by some Western rulers or institutions, e.g., princes funding observatories. Also crucial was the printing press, Western Europe, mid-15th century, which rapidly disseminated new scientific knowledge across Europe, creating an information network that other regions lacked at the time. Why unique to the West? Other civilizations achieved impressive empirical knowledge and inventions. China had advanced technology, gunpowder, compasses, paper, and some observational astronomy. The Islamic Golden Age, 9th-12th centuries, made strides in math, optics, and medicine and preserved Greek science, but neither resulted in a self-sustaining scientific revolution that continually expanded fundamental knowledge. Often, cultural or institutional factors eventually slowed their scientific inquiry. For instance, after the 12th century, Islamic science waned as conservative religious forces grew wary of secular learning. In China, the state's priorities and lack of competition hindered a scientific method revolution, and some technology was used pragmatically -- scientific inquiry and the scientific revolution. Western civilization uniquely fostered the scientific revolution, a transformative era, 16th-17th centuries, when systematic observation, experimentation, and mathematical analysis became the preferred way to understand nature. This tenet is exemplified by figures like Galileo Galilei, Isaac Newton, and others who overturned ancient cosmologies and discovered natural laws. Western scientists adopted the scientific method, formulating hypotheses and testing them by experiment and evidence. They also built institutions, e.g. the Royal Society in London, to share knowledge openly, making science a cumulative, collaborative enterprise. The results were spectacular. Copernicus and Galileo showed that Earth revolves around the Sun. Newton formulated universal laws of gravity and motion. Inventors and anatomists advanced technology and medicine. By embracing reason and evidence over tradition, the West, in a short span, unlocked secrets of physics, astronomy, chemistry, and biology, setting the stage for the modern technological world. This scientific spirit was bolstered by Western cultural factors: the inheritance of Greek rational inquiry, the Renaissance curiosity about nature, and a degree of intellectual freedom, sometimes fought for against religious resistance, as Galileo's saga shows. Crucially, Western thinkers believed nature operated by consistent laws that human intellect could discern, an idea reinforced by both Judeo-Christian notions of an orderly creation and Greek logic. As science progressed, it became a core Western value to seek objective truth about the material world. The concept of progress through science took root, feeding into the Western idea of continual improvement. Comparatively, while other civilizations achieved significant technical and scholarly feats, none institutionalized science quite like the West did. Islamic scholars in the medieval period preserved and expanded knowledge, algebra, optics, etc., but after a certain point, many Islamic regions grew wary of free scientific inquiry, and it did not culminate in an ongoing scientific revolution. China had great inventions and observational astronomy, yet its state and scholarly class did not develop an experimental scientific methodology or autonomous scientific institutions. Innovation was often empirical and geared toward practical use rather than theory testing, and centralized authority at times discouraged radical new ideas. In societies where questioning nature could conflict with religious or traditional authority, scientific advances slowed. The West's distinctive achievement was to make science self-correcting and ever-expanding, relatively insulated from political or theological control in the long run. This relentless scientific pursuit became a hallmark of Western modernity and led to Western global dominance in technology. It also shaped a worldview. Western culture increasingly saw the universe as knowable and governed by natural law, a perspective that has since spread worldwide. The expectation that through reason and experiment we can conquer disease, harness energy, and explain the cosmos is a fundamentally Western legacy, born of the scientific revolution. Enlightenment, rationalism, and secularism. The Enlightenment of the 17th-18th centuries was an intellectual movement in the West that built on scientific advances to apply reason and skepticism to society, politics, and religion. Enlightenment thinkers argued that human affairs should be guided by rational principles and empirical evidence, not by superstition or unquestioned tradition. This tenet led to a surge of secularism, the idea that religion should not dictate public policy or knowledge, and to bold proposals for improving human society through critical thought and debate. Enlightenment philosophers such as Voltaire, John Locke, Montesquieu, and Immanuel Kant championed ideals of freedom of thought, toleration, constitutional government, and human equality. They questioned absolute monarchy and the divine right of kings, instead advocating social contracts and separation of powers in government, Montesquieu's influence. They also critiqued the undue influence of organized religion. Voltaire famously satirized religious dogma with the motto, "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the infamous thing, referring to fanaticism and superstition. Importantly, the Enlightenment didn't reject religion entirely. Many thinkers were deists, believing in a creator but not organized churches. But it asserted that reason and human experience should be the final arbiters in intellectual life. Knowledge was to be discovered by investigation and debate. Hence, the Encyclopédie project in France compiled all knowledge for open reference. The period saw a push for education reform, scientific inquiry in all fields, including the first social sciences, and the idea that progress is possible in human society just as in science. Contrasting perspective, Enlightenment values were a sharp departure from medieval attitudes, and were not paralleled in the same way elsewhere at that time. In non-Western regions, traditional structures remained strong well into the 19th century. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, or Qing China, questioning the established social order or state religion/ideology could be dangerous, and there was no equivalent widespread movement calling for secular governance and universal rights. When similar ideas did emerge outside the West, it was often due to Western influence or internal crises that prompted leaders to seek Western models. The Enlightenment's secular, rationalist ethos led Western nations to begin separating church authority from state, and to promote laws based on natural rights rather than scripture, a distinctively Western trajectory. Even within the West, Enlightenment ideas met resistance. Not every Western region embraced them equally at first, but over time they became deeply embedded in Western identity. The distinctiveness of the Enlightenment lies in how it transformed Western thought. It made critical reason the gold standard for legitimacy. This laid the groundwork for modern democracy, legal rights, and scientific progress to flourish hand in hand. It is why Western societies were among the first to abolish torture as a legal practice, to enshrine freedom of the press, and to institute mass education, all justified by rational humanistic arguments. Secularism, as a policy of the state staying neutral in religion, also stems from Enlightenment thinking, e.g. the United States First Amendment, or the French laïcité tradition. These shifts are now common in many countries, but their origin is Western Enlightenment thought, which makes Western civilization unique in having self-consciously reinvented its guiding principles on the basis of reason, liberalism, and natural rights. Flowing from Enlightenment ideals, liberalism emerged in the West as a political philosophy centered on the freedom and rights of the individual. At its core is the doctrine of natural rights, the belief that people inherently possess rights, such as life, liberty, property, and later, the pursuit of happiness, that no government can legitimately take away. Liberalism also calls for government by consent. Laws and rulers are justified only if people agree to them, and for limits on authority to protect individual freedoms. This tenet became the bedrock of modern Western political systems and distinguishes Western governance by its emphasis on personal liberty and limited government. The origins of liberalism are often traced to thinkers like John Locke, who in the late 17th century argued that individuals form governments via a social contract to secure their pre-existing natural rights, and if a government fails or abuses power, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. These ideas directly influenced landmark Western political events. The American Revolution 1776 and the French Revolution 1789 both drew on liberal concepts. The American Declaration of Independence explicitly invokes natural rights and government by consent, while the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen 1789 proclaims liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression as fundamental rights. Throughout the 19th century, liberal movements in Europe and the Americas pushed for constitutions, elected parliaments, freedom of speech and religion, and the rule of law, dismantling old feudal or absolute monarchic structures. Liberalism also underlies the expansion of suffrage. Though initially many liberals limited voting to property owners, over time the principle of equal rights led to universal suffrage. Economic liberalism, advocated by Adam Smith and others, argued for free markets and private enterprise as extensions of individual liberty. How it contrasts. The liberal emphasis on individual rights was relatively novel. In many other cultures, the individual was traditionally seen in the context of family, caste, or community obligations, and rulers were not seen as beholden to the will of the governed. For example, in 18th century Asia or Africa, it was uncommon to find political doctrines insisting that ordinary people had inherent political rights that authorities must respect. When non-Western nations encountered liberal ideas, often via colonialism or missionaries, these concepts were radical to established orders, such as in Japan's Meiji era when they studied Western liberal constitutions, or in colonial India when reformers read Locke and Mill and began demanding self-rule and rights. Even within Western civilization, implementing liberal ideals was a gradual struggle, but the key point is that the articulation of those ideals, that each person is an autonomous bearer of rights and that state power derives from the people's delegation, is a Western creation that has no exact parallel in pre-modern non-Western political thought. Some might note that certain ancient traditions, like Buddhist or Stoic respect for individuals, or the Iroquois Confederacy's consensual politics, share bits of ethos, but liberalism as a comprehensive doctrine of individual rights and constitutional government is distinctly Western. This tenet is now nearly universal as an aspirational standard, seen in the United Nations language and many national constitutions, showing Western liberalism's global influence. In practice, Western nations led the way in abolishing slavery because it violated natural rights principles, establishing freedom of the press and religion, and instituting checks and balances in government. The liberal tradition is why Western societies emphasize personal autonomy so strongly in law and culture. It is also why Western-origin international norms focus on individual human rights. All these can be traced to the liberal philosophy that took shape in Europe and North America, making Western civilization the cradle of modern concepts of liberty, constitutionalism, and separation of powers. Hand in hand with liberal ideas came the Western commitment to constitutionalism, the principle that government should be limited and defined by a written or unwritten constitution. This includes organizing the state with separation of powers into branches, executive, legislative, judicial, that can check and balance each other. The tenet ensures that no single person or group holds unchecked authority, and that laws, rather than the whims of rulers, govern the land. Western nations were pioneers in devising constitutional systems to safeguard liberty and prevent tyranny. The evolution of constitutionalism in the West has deep roots. The Magna Carta, 1215, in England, was a proto-constitutional document compelling the king to acknowledge certain legal bounds and noble rights. Over centuries, England developed an unwritten constitution, balancing power between monarch, parliament, and courts. By the 1689 English Bill of Rights, it was affirmed that the monarch could not suspend laws or levy taxes without Parliament's consent, embedding rule of law and parliamentary supremacy. Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu analyzed governments and advocated clearly defined separation of powers. In the Spirit of Laws, 1748, he praised the English system's division of executive, legislature, and an independent judiciary. These ideas profoundly shaped new constitutions. The United States Constitution, 1787, is a landmark, creating a federal republic with a president, bicameral Congress, and judiciary, each with distinct powers and abilities to veto or modify the other's actions, e.g., presidential veto, legislative override, judicial review. Many Latin American and European countries in the 19th century followed suit, writing constitutions that enshrined rights and distributed powers. Even constitutional monarchies, like 19th century Britain or later Norway, limited the king's role and empowered elected bodies. By the 20th century, constitutional government became the norm in the West. Even newer institutions like the European Union operate under constitutional treaties. Different elsewhere, non-Western civilizations historically often vested power in a single locus, an emperor, sultan, or oligarchy, without formal checks. Traditional Asian empires did not have written constitutions. The emperor's edicts were law. Though Confucian ministers could remonstrate morally, the concept of legal limits was absent. In Islamic governance, while the ruler was theoretically bound to Islamic law, there wasn't a separate judiciary independent of the ruler's influence, judges were often appointed by him, and no concept of a representative legislature until modern times. The idea of writing a supreme law code that even the ruler must obey was not realized in, say, Mughal India or Safavid Persia. When Japan created a constitution in 1889, or the Ottoman Empire in 1876 attempted one, these were explicitly inspired by Western models to modernize. Many newly independent nations in the 20th century likewise adopted Western-style constitutions, with varying success in practice. Tribal societies often balanced power in councils, but those were small-scale and based on custom, not a formal written charter that defined governmental structure. The Western insistence on constitutionalism is evident in how Western countries will undergo major effort to craft or amend constitutions to address issues, rather than allow ad hoc rule. It's part of Western political DNA that government authority comes through law and must operate under law. This tenet made Western governments comparatively stable and predictable. It also protected rights. Constitutions often contain bills of rights, like the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution, or the French Declaration appended to later constitutions, to legally guarantee individual freedoms. The separation of powers doctrine prevented any single faction from easily capturing the entire state, a stark contrast to one-party or autocratic regimes elsewhere. In sum, the Western practice of constitutional governance, with its intricate checks and balances, is a distinctive political innovation that has been emulated worldwide, but is fundamentally a Western creation, reflecting the civilization's deep concern with limiting power to protect liberty, representative democracy, and popular sovereignty. By the 19th and 20th centuries, Western civilization had fully embraced representative democracy, a system in which officials are elected to represent the people, and popular sovereignty, the idea that all authority ultimately rests with the people, is the governing principle. This modern democratic tenet grew from the earlier foundations of Athenian democracy and Roman republicanism, but it extended participation to the masses, and made regular competitive elections the legitimate way to form governments. In Western countries, monarchies, where retained, became largely ceremonial or constitutionally constrained, and power shifted to elected parliaments and presidents. The notion that government exists to serve the people and derives its mandate from the people's consent through voting became a core Western political value. The spread of suffrage in the West illustrates this evolution. In the early 1800s, many Western nations still had limited franchises. Property requirements for voting were common. Over that century, Reform Acts in Britain expanded the vote step by step to nearly all adult men by 1918 and then to women by 1928. The United States initially enfranchised most white males by the mid-19th century, later extending the vote to black men after the Civil War, though with setbacks in practice until the Civil Rights Movement, and to women by 1920. France oscillated during the 19th century, but eventually settled into a stable republic with universal male and then female suffrage. This trend reflected the Western commitment to the idea that every adult citizen should have an equal say in choosing leaders and shaping laws. By mid-20th century, virtually all Western countries were electoral democracies. Aside from the interruption of fascist regimes which were seen as a direct assault on Western democratic ideals and were defeated in World War II, the Western Allies then helped democratize West Germany, Italy, Japan, a non-Western nation influenced by Western models post-1945, etc. Institutions like political parties, elected legislatures, secret ballots, and periodic elections became standard fixtures of Western governance. Global contrast. Historically, no other civilization had developed large-scale representative democracy with universal suffrage before Western influence. Indigenous governance varied, but even those with participatory elements, like the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, were on a small scale and did not use mass elections as we know them. Non-Western empires and kingdoms rested on aristocratic or bureaucratic rule, not on electoral representation of the populace. For example, in Imperial Russia, czars ruled autocratically until Western-inspired reforms introduced a legislature, Duma, only in the early 20th century, and it took the collapse of czarist rule to attempt democracy, which then succumbed to communist one-party rule. In China, the imperial system had no concept of elections. It wasn't until the 20th century, under Western influence and Republican revolution, that ideas of representative government were seriously attempted, and even then democracy did not take hold long before communist authoritarianism arose. Many new countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East adopted democratic constitutions upon independence mid-20th century, directly modeled on Western systems, e.g., India's parliamentary system follows the British model, which underscores that modern democracy was essentially a Western export. The distinctive Western achievement was not just inventing democracy, the Greeks did that, but scaling it up to nation-states with millions of people, and institutionalizing it so that leadership changes could happen peacefully and regularly. Western nations normalized the idea of political opposition as legitimate, different parties competing in elections, rather than treasonous. They also embedded the principle that the people as a whole are the ultimate political authority, we the people, as the U.S. Constitution famously begins. This concept of popular sovereignty was radical compared to older doctrines that authority came from gods or tradition. In practice, it gave Western societies a mechanism for self-correction and responsiveness to public will that many other systems lacked. Over time, this democratic tenet became one of the most admired, if not always implemented, aspects of Western civilization worldwide. It remains a defining characteristic. When one thinks of Western political values, one thinks of free elections, parliaments, and the right of citizens to choose their government, all products of centuries of development within the Western world. Capitalism and free markets. Western civilization also championed capitalism, an economic system rooted in private property, free enterprise, and voluntary exchange in markets. This tenet holds that individuals have the right to own property and businesses, to seek profit, and to trade goods and services in a largely free market, with minimal government interference, beyond enforcing contracts and basic regulations. While trade and markets exist in all civilizations, the West uniquely developed capitalism into a dominant economic ethos and paired it with industrial innovation, creating unprecedented wealth and productivity. Historically, elements of capitalism grew in late medieval and early modern Europe. The Italian city-states, and later the Dutch Republic in England, nurtured a merchant class and banking systems, e.g. the Medici banks, the Amsterdam Exchange, The Protestant work ethic, as theorized by Max Weber, and the decline of feudalism made commerce and entrepreneurial success more socially acceptable and praiseworthy in northwestern Europe. Adam Smith's work, The Wealth of Nations, 1776, a product of the Scottish Enlightenment, outlined the principles of free markets and the invisible hand, arguing that when individuals pursue their own economic interest under conditions of competition, it leads to greater prosperity and societal benefit. Western countries increasingly embraced these ideas. Property rights were strongly protected by law. Tariffs within nations were lowered, e.g., the creation of national common markets like the customs union in Germany, and industrialists were free to invest and innovate. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 18th century, was both a product of and a catalyst for capitalism. As factories rose, so did demand for capital investment, wage labor, and global raw materials and markets. By the 19th century, Britain and the United States exemplified capitalist economies, with rapid growth, a spirit of invention, and also the booms and busts that come with market cycles. Under capitalism, Western society saw the rise of a middle class and unprecedented social mobility through commerce. Economic freedom became tied to personal freedom in Western thought. Owning property or a business meant a kind of independence. Western legal systems innovated to support capitalism. Corporate law allowed the formation of joint stock companies, ancestors of modern corporations, that could pool capital for large ventures, like the British East India Company or Hudson's Bay Company. Contract law became more uniform and reliable, and bankruptcy laws evolved to handle business risks. Financial markets, stock exchanges in London, New York, etc., allowed investment and capital raising on a large scale. All these developments were hallmarks of a distinctly Western path that by the late 19th century had made Europe and America the wealthiest regions in the world. Comparison. Other civilizations were slower to adopt capitalist practices, or did so under Western influence. For example, in Mughal India or Qing China, commerce was active, but the state and cultural norms placed more restrictions on merchants. In China, merchants were historically regarded as lower status, and the state often intervened in trade. In India, caste rules could limit certain economic activities. Moreover, property was less securely private. For instance, in the Ottoman Empire, much land was officially owned by the Sultan, the Timur system, and could be reallocated, discouraging long-term private investment in improvements. Islamic law's prohibition of usury, charging interest, historically limited banking development in Islamic regions. Workarounds existed, but credit markets were less developed than in the West. In many places, guilds or traditions fixed prices and production, whereas Western capitalism favored open competition to set prices. When Japan began to industrialize in the late 19th century, Meiji Restoration, it consciously imported Western economic models, and other societies often did the same under colonial pressure or post-colonial reform. Capitalism has become global, but its individualistic profit motive and reliance on impersonal markets reflect Western values of individual initiative and rationality. It's a system that thrives on innovation and competition, traits encouraged by Western legal and cultural frameworks. The distinctive outcome for the West was the sustained economic growth and improvement in living standards from roughly the 18th century onward, far outpacing previous eras. This created modern consumer society and transformed daily life, e.g., railroads, automobiles, mass-produced goods, largely fruits of capitalist enterprise. Western capitalism also brought challenges like economic inequality and cycles of recession, which Western societies addressed with further innovations, labor laws, social safety nets, interestingly blending capitalism with another Western tenet, compassion, in the form of welfare states. Nonetheless, the basic acceptance of the free market as the engine of prosperity is a Western legacy that has been adopted to varying degrees worldwide. It remains a defining trait. When one contrasts Western-style economy with others, one is usually referring to a market-driven capitalist system as opposed to command or traditional economies. Industrialization and technological progress. Fueled by its scientific and capitalist ethos, Western civilization was the first to undergo industrialization, the shift from agrarian, handcraft economies to industrial, machine-powered production. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the late 1700s and spread through Europe and North America in the 1800s, utterly transforming society. This tenet encompasses not just the technological innovations, steam engines, factories, railways, but also a cultural embrace of progress, the belief that through ingenuity and industrial development, humans can dramatically improve standards of living and even master their environment. During the Industrial Revolution, Western societies developed mechanized manufacturing. Textile mills with spinning jennies and power looms could produce cloth far faster than traditional weavers. James Watt's improved steam engine, 1760s, provided a new power source for mines, mills, and eventually locomotives and steamships. Coal and later oil became the fuels driving Western industry. By the mid-19th century, cities like Manchester or Pittsburgh were booming industrial centers. Western nations built vast railroad networks. The first public railway in England opened in 1825, and steamship lines that shrank travel times. Communication leapfrogged with the telegraph. First transatlantic telegraph cable in 1858, connecting Europe and America in minutes. This rapid advancement was propelled by Western scientific knowledge and entrepreneurial enterprise. Inventors like Edison, Siemens, or the Wright brothers exemplify the continual Western drive to innovate technologically. Industrialization radically increased Western military and economic power, mass-produced weapons, steel warships, etc., contributing to Western global dominance in the 19th century. It also changed social structures. A new urban working class emerged, as did industrial capitalists. Western societies had to adapt with new ideas, like socialism and trade unions, to address issues of labor, which themselves became part of Western discourse on progress and reform. Importantly, Western culture by the 19th century firmly adopted the notion of linear progress, that each generation could be materially better off than the last, thanks to technology and industry. World fairs and expositions showcased Western inventions, from the telephone to the automobile, as triumphs of human achievement. Education systems in the West increasingly emphasize science and engineering to keep the momentum of innovation. Elsewhere, no other civilization had an indigenous industrial revolution during that period. For example, China and India had been centers of craftsmanship and were economically large through most of history, but their production methods remained labor-intensive and guild-based until Western influence forced change. When confronted with industrialized Western powers, often via colonization or military defeat, non-Western nations realized they had fallen behind technologically. Japan's rapid industrialization after 1868, the Meiji Restoration, was explicitly a campaign to catch up with the West. And indeed, Japan became the first non-Western fully industrialized nation by adopting Western techniques and institutions wholesale. Other regions industrialized largely in the 20th century, borrowing Western technology. The Western combination of factors, available capital, scientific know-how, supportive political structures, and culture of innovation, was singular in producing early industrial takeoff. This gave the West roughly a century's head start. The hallmark of an industrial society, which is now common globally, was first and foremost a Western hallmark. Factories, urbanization, mechanized transport, and a mindset that welcomes novelty and productive efficiency. Even the social responses, like Marxism, a Western ideology responding to industrial capitalism's downsides, and the regulatory state, Western governments passing factory acts, etc., show how Western civ navigated industrial growth. In essence, Western civilization's identity became tied to being technologically advanced and future-oriented. Whereas earlier societies often looked to a golden past, the industrial West looked to the promise of the future. New machines, new inventions improving life. This faith in technological progress remains a Western trait, now broadly shared worldwide. From the space age to the digital revolution, the West has often led with inventions, computers, internet, and maintained an attitude that problems, be it disease, hunger, or climate issues, can be solved with enough innovation. The Industrial Revolution thus not only gave the West economic might, but also a distinct confidence in man's ability to shape his destiny through technology, setting it apart from more traditionalist cultures. The idea of progress. Underlying many Western tenets is a fundamental optimism known as the idea of progress. The belief that through reason, science, and good social organization, the human condition will improve over time. While many pre-modern cultures saw history as cyclic or in decline from a past golden age, Western civilization, especially since the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, adopted a largely linear view of history trending upward. This notion of progress became almost a civilizational creed. Each generation could advance beyond the last in knowledge, rights, and prosperity. The Enlightenment cemented this concept. Philosophies like Condorcet wrote about the indefinite perfectibility of mankind, the notion that society could be reformed via education, rational laws, etc., and that such reforms would accumulate, marked a sharp break from medieval thinking that tended to view the past, classical antiquity or the age of religious revelation, as superior. During the 19th century, tangible evidence of progress, longer lifespans, lower infant mortality, rising literacy, technological marvels, reinforced Westerners' confidence in moving forward. Victorian Britain, for example, often celebrated how far civilization had come from dark ages. Even in the 20th century, despite setbacks like world wars, Western narrative often framed those conflicts as struggles after which progress could resume, e.g., the formation of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were seen as moral progress after World War II. Western modern ideologies like liberalism, socialism, and feminism all presuppose that changing old systems can improve society fundamentally, an inherently progress-oriented mindset. This faith in progress also translated into movements to address social ills. Western activists fought to abolish slavery, to end child labor, to expand education and political rights, believing that moral progress accompanies scientific progress. Over time, Western countries enacted widespread public schooling, expanded the franchise to all adults, and developed welfare policies, all justified by the idea that society can become more just and advanced. The Western canon of thought even extends progress to global terms. Development economics and international aid are built on the premise that less developed societies can and should progress, materially and institutionally, toward the model pioneered by the West. Differing worldviews. Not all cultures traditionally shared this future-oriented outlook. Classical Hindu and Buddhist thought saw history in vast cycles, yugas or kalpas, where improvement is temporary at best. The goal was often spiritual liberation from the cycle, not improving the cycle itself. Confucian China looked back to an idealized early Zhou dynasty for proper order. Progress meant restoring past harmony rather than forging something novel. Many indigenous cultures prioritize living in balance with timeless traditions, rather than constantly transforming their material conditions. That doesn't mean non-Western peoples never sought improvements, but it wasn't elevated to an ideology in the way it became in the West. When Japan modernized, or when Turkey secularized under Ataturk, they explicitly invoked the Western idea of progress, framing tradition as something to overcome for the sake of advancement. Today, phrases like developing country versus developed country reflect a Western progress narrative applied globally, implying all societies are on one timeline of advancement, an idea not native to those societies historically. The distinctiveness of Western belief in progress lies in its breadth. It's not just technological or economic, but moral and social. It imbues Western political speeches, education, history often taught as a story of advancement, and collective goals. E.g., the Sustainable Development Goals in international policy are essentially a progress checklist rooted in Western developmentalism. While recent Western thought has become more nuanced, recognizing that not all change is good and progress can regress, especially with concerns like environmental degradation, the general orientation remains. Western culture expects and strives for improvement. This teleological perspective, that history is going somewhere better, is a signature difference in how Western civilization conceives time and human potential, and it provides a driving force behind continuous reform and innovation. Nation-state and nationalism. Western civilization gave rise to the modern nation-state, a political unit defined by a common nation, people with shared culture/language and a sense of identity, and sovereign territory, and its companion ideology, nationalism. While people's loyalty to kin or locale is ancient, the Western development, especially from the 18th century onward, was to fuse cultural identity with political sovereignty. This tenet holds that a nation, a culturally bonded people, has the right to self-determination and its own state. It transformed the map of Europe and eventually the world, replacing empires and feudal domains with countries like France, Italy, Germany, built around national unity. The roots of Western nationalism can be seen in the late Middle Ages, when languages and cultures started to coalesce under centralized kingdoms, e.g., the rise of vernacular literature like Dante's in Italian or Chaucer's in English fostered national consciousness. However, nationalism as a mass political force truly emerged with events like the French Revolution, 1789, which declared the sovereignty of the French nation as opposed to the king. Revolutionary France introduced the idea of citizenship tied to a nation and mass conscription, levée en masse, under the notion that citizens fight for their fatherland. In the 19th century, nationalist movements swept Europe. Germany and Italy were each unified out of many small states, largely because of nationalist fervor. People who spoke German or Italian came to believe they ought to form one nation-state. The collapse of multi-ethnic empires, Austrian, Ottoman, and World War I, further solidified the principle. Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points, 1918, explicitly championed self-determination for nations as a basis for post-war order. As a result, new nation-states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, etc., emerged in Europe. National flags, national anthems, and national holidays became potent symbols in Western life, reflecting how deeply nationalism took hold of the popular imagination. Western nationalism often had a civic dimension, especially in places like France or the US, where being part of the nation was tied to embracing certain ideals or citizenship, not just ethnicity, as well as an ethnic dimension. In Central/Eastern Europe, nationalism was frequently about language and ethnic heritage. Either way, the Western idea was that political legitimacy comes from representing a distinct people. This was a shift from earlier legitimacy derived from dynasty or religion. It also motivated colonial subjects in the 20th century to demand their own nation-states. Anti-colonial nationalism in Asia/Africa was heavily inspired by Western nationalist ideology. Other political structures. Before this Western-led nationalist era, large political entities were usually empires or kingdoms defined by ruling dynasties, not by the homogeneous consent of the governed. For instance, the Ottoman Empire ruled diverse peoples, Turks, Arabs, Balkan Christians, etc., under one sultan. Identity was local or religious, but not Ottoman nationhood in a modern sense. In China, there was a strong cultural identity as Chinese, but the polity was an imperial state with fluid borders incorporating different ethnic groups, e.g., Manchus, Mongols, under one emperor. The concept of dividing territory into clearly bounded sovereign states, each representing one nation, came late to these regions, essentially imported from the West, e.g., the Westphalian system of international relations. Many non-Western nationalisms were reactions to Western domination, Indian nationalism against British rule, for example, or the rise of Arab nationalism partly spurred by the fall of the Ottoman Empire and European mandates, showing how the Western model of nation-state became the template to strive for. The Western origin of the nation-state has had a lasting global impact. Today the world is divided into nation-states as the basic units of international affairs. A European idea turned universal norm. Nationalism can have positive aspects, uniting people under self-rule, and negative ones, exclusion, chauvinism, conflicts with other nationalisms. Both aspects were visible in Western history, from the unification of Germany's science and music flowering to the aggressive ultranationalism of the world wars. Nonetheless, what makes this a core Western tenet is that it recast loyalty and identity in terms of nation rather than ruler or locality. Westerners came to see themselves foremost as French, English, American, German, etc., members of a national community with common culture and destiny. That notion of patriotic identity around a nation-state is now common worldwide, but originated as a distinctively Western trajectory in the last few centuries. Universal human rights and humanitarianism. In the modern era, Western civilization has been at the forefront of articulating and promoting universal human rights. The idea that all people, regardless of nationality, race, or religion, possess certain inalienable rights simply by virtue of being human. This tenet, an outgrowth of earlier concepts like natural rights and human dignity, took concrete form after the global catastrophes of the world wars, when Western leaders led the creation of international frameworks for rights. Alongside this, a strong ethos of humanitarianism developed in the West. The belief that there is a moral obligation to aid and protect others in distress, even across borders. One pinnacle of this Western-led initiative was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, adopted by the United Nations in 1948. Drafted with significant input from Western figures, like Eleanor Roosevelt, it enumerates rights to life, liberty, equality before the law, freedom of thought and religion, and more, meant to apply to all humans. This was a capstone of a long Western journey, from Magna Carta to the Enlightenment rights of man, and through atrocities like the Holocaust that underscored the need for universal standards beyond state sovereignty. Western nations also drove the formation of the Geneva Conventions, 19th and 20th centuries, to protect victims of war, wounded soldiers, prisoners, civilians, reflecting a humanitarian impulse to civilize warfare and uphold human dignity even in conflict. Western charities and NGOs, such as the Red Cross, founded by Swiss humanitarian Henri Dunant in 1863, set early models for neutral aid in disasters and conflicts, an embodiment of humanitarian principles. This global human rights emphasis often stood in tension with pure nationalism, but many in the West reconciled it by viewing human rights as part of Western values to be championed universally. Western democracies during the Cold War frequently presented themselves as defenders of human rights in contrast to communist regimes, which had their own rhetoric on social/economic rights. Moreover, Western public opinion and media have often responded strongly to humanitarian crises abroad, pressuring governments to act, for instance, famines in Africa prompting large Western-led relief efforts, or campaigns to end apartheid in South Africa on moral grounds. The concept of international law protecting individuals, not just states, is largely Western origin, exemplified by tribunals like the Nuremberg trials judging war crimes, and later the International Criminal Court. These arise from the Western notion that there are universal moral norms that transcend cultural relativism or state consent. Outside influences. Elements of humanistic ethics certainly exist in other cultures. All major religions preach compassion, for example. Yet, the formal codification of individual rights was not a feature of non-Western governance until modern times, often adopted under Western influence or pressure. For instance, traditional societies tended to focus on duties and community harmony rather than explicit individual rights. The concept of human rights sometimes clashes with local customs. For example, gender equality rights challenge patriarchal practices in many societies, and freedom of speech can conflict with laws against blasphemy or insult in various non-Western countries. Indeed, some Asian political leaders in the 1990s argued Asian values prioritized community and order over Western individual rights. However, human rights activism has also taken root worldwide, often spearheaded by Western or Western-educated activists and supported by Western-based organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch. The humanitarian aspect, like intervening or providing aid purely out of concern for human welfare, while not unique to the West in sentiment, has been uniquely scaled by Western wealth and global reach. Western nations are typically the largest foreign aid donors, and Western publics donate massively to disaster relief, whether for a tsunami in Southeast Asia or an earthquake in Haiti. Critics might note such aid can have political motives mingled in, but the abiding ideal presented is altruistic, that a life in a distant land has value and suffering should be alleviated. This fairly universalist ethic wasn't the governing principle of empires or tribes historically, which often prioritized their own group. It's a product of the Enlightenment and Christian moral influence, combining into a secular commitment to universal human well-being. In sum, the Western drive to define, guarantee, and enforce human rights for all, and to undertake humanitarian action across the globe, is a distinctive trait. It took the Western philosophical assertion that all men are created equal and pushed it to a global, inclusive conclusion. While implementation is imperfect and often selective, the very existence of an international human rights regime and frequent humanitarian interventions, whether through diplomacy, sanctions on rights-abusing regimes, or on-the-ground aid, showcases Western civilization's outward projection of its core values of dignity and compassion to all humanity. This tenet has arguably become part of a global ethic, but its intellectual and practical origins lie heavily in the West. freedom of speech and expression. Among the most cherished values in Western civilization is the freedom of speech and expression. This tenet asserts that individuals have the right to speak, publish, and communicate ideas without fear of censorship or punishment by the government, as long as they do not directly harm others, with narrowly defined exceptions like incitement or defamation. Freedom of the press, artistic freedom, academic freedom, all fall under this umbrella. Western societies came to view open debate and the marketplace of ideas as essential to truth-seeking, good governance, and personal liberty. The roots of this value can be traced to ancient Athens, where open debate was part of democratic life, and Stoic philosophy, which valued frankness, or parrhesia. But it truly took hold in the West during and after the Enlightenment. In 1644, the English poet John Milton wrote Areopagitica, one of the earliest impassioned defenses of press freedom, arguing that truth would emerge from the conflict of ideas in a free, uncensored environment. In the 18th century, Voltaire's famous remark, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," a sentiment attributed to him, encapsulated the Enlightenment stance on tolerating even offensive speech. Consequently, new democracies enshrined free expression. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, 1791, explicitly forbids Congress from abridging freedom of speech or of the press. Similarly, the 1789 French Declaration of the Rights of Man guaranteed free communication of ideas. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, Western nations dismantled most legal censorship. Blasphemy and sedition laws waned. Press licensing ended. A vibrant civil society flourished with newspapers criticizing leaders, citizens assembling and protesting, and satirists poking fun at authority, all seen as healthy for society. Free speech became so ingrained that even extremely unpopular speech, neo-Nazi marches for example, has been legally protected in many Western countries under principle, to demonstrate commitment to the rule rather than exceptions. In contrast, in many non-Western societies, historically, speech was far more restricted. Monarchies, theocracies, and other authoritarian systems across the world commonly enforced strict limits on dissent. For instance, criticizing the emperor in imperial China or Japan could be a capital offense. Blasphemy against state religion in medieval Islamic or Christian realms was harshly punished. The West had to go through its own painful progress to ease such laws. The concept of a free press was virtually non-existent outside a few experiments until Western colonial influence introduced it. For example, printing presses in the Ottoman Empire were initially heavily controlled. When Indian reformers or Chinese republicans started newspapers, they were emulating Western journalistic norms. Even today, many countries in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa have more authoritarian approaches to speech, state media domination, censorship of dissent, imprisonment of journalists or bloggers, reflecting differing values or priorities such as communal harmony, respect for authority, or regime stability over the Western ideal of individual free expression. That said, the influence of the Western free speech norm is global in aspirations. International human rights law, e.g., Article 19 of the UDHR, upholds freedom of expression, largely due to Western advocacy. The Western distinctive view is that open debate and criticism improve society by allowing bad ideas to be challenged and good ideas to prevail. This is closely tied to Western scientific and democratic practices. Science needs free inquiry, democracy needs free debate. Historically, Western societies discovered that suppressing speech often backfires or masks problems rather than solving them. As a result, Western legal systems develop strong protections. Independent courts often strike down laws that infringe on speech, e.g., the U.S. Supreme Court defending the right to burn a flag or publish controversial opinions. Culturally, Westerners came to see speaking one's mind as a basic aspect of dignity and authenticity. Thinkers like John Stuart Mill, in his essay on Liberty, 1859, provided philosophical grounding, arguing silencing an opinion robs society of the chance to refine truth. Freedom of expression is now one of the most visible Western exports, sometimes causing friction. For example, Western media's right to publish satire or criticism of religion can anger those in cultures where reverence is expected over satire. But Western societies usually defend the principle even when specific speech is offensive or inconvenient, believing the long-term health of an open society outweighs short-term discomfort. This commitment to free expression, from political dissent to artistic creativity, is a signature of Western civilization. It has enabled the West to be extraordinarily innovative and self-correcting, as ideas can be aired and tested. It also underpins personal development. Individuals are free to form and voice their own opinions, shaping distinct identities. In a world where many have adopted at least some free speech principles, the robust degree to which Western civilization has institutionalized it remains distinctive. Freedom of religion and conscience. Another pillar of Western civilization, closely related to free speech, is freedom of religion. The right of individuals to hold and practice the religious beliefs of their choice, or to have no religion, without coercion or persecution. This emerged from Western history after long religious conflicts, crystallizing in the idea that faith is a personal matter of conscience, not to be dictated by rulers or imposed by force. The West thus pioneered the concept of a secular state that neutrally guarantees religious liberty to all citizens. The journey to this principle was arduous. Post-Reformation Europe was ravaged by religious wars, Catholics versus Protestants. The exhaustion and horror of sectarian violence gradually convinced thinkers and some rulers that toleration was preferable to endless conflict. Figures like John Locke penned works such as A Letter Concerning Toleration, 1689, arguing that civil government should not interfere in matters of the soul, and that true faith cannot be compelled by force. Pioneering examples of religious freedom began to appear. The Edict of Nantes, 1598, granted limited toleration to French Protestants, though it was later revoked. More enduringly, colonial Rhode Island, founded 1636 by Roger Williams, and Pennsylvania, founded 1682 by William Penn, were notable Western experiments in broad religious freedom, welcoming dissenters of many stripes. By the late 18th century, freedom of religion was enshrined in founding documents of new nations. The United States Constitution explicitly forbids a state religion and protects free exercise of faith, a radical departure from the state church models of Europe. The French Revolution initially proclaimed religious liberty as well. Though it became hostile to the church during the radical phase, it later settled into a secular but tolerant stance under Napoleon's Concordat. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, most Western countries removed legal disabilities that had been imposed on religious minorities. For example, Britain emancipated Catholics and Jews from various restrictions by 1850s. Western secularism doesn't mean irreligion. It means the state stays neutral, and individuals choose their creed. Churches and synagogues of many denominations coexisted in Western cities, and later mosques and temples, with the understanding that all are free to worship as they will. This climate allowed new religious movements to arise, Methodists, Mormons, etc., and also allowed an environment where skepticism or atheism could be openly expressed, a rarity elsewhere historically. By contrast, historically, many civilizations enforced a dominant religion. In the Islamic world, while there was a degree of tolerance for people of the book, Christians and Jews under Islamic rule, it was a hierarchical tolerance. Non-Muslims paid special taxes and had inferior legal status, and apostasy from Islam was forbidden. Conversion away from the majority religion was often met with severe penalties, a norm that Western countries used to share in earlier eras but later abandoned. In Catholic Spain before and during the Inquisition, or in many Muslim-majority countries even now, the idea of a Muslim freely becoming a Christian or vice versa, or someone abandoning religion entirely, was anathema. India before modern times didn't have a single enforced religion due to its diversity, but social pressure and caste bounds effectively locked people into the religion of their birth. Conversion was rare and sometimes met with ostracism. China traditionally expected adherence to a mix of ancestor worship and state-endorsed philosophies. Deviating too much, like certain sects deemed heterodox, was often suppressed. It was Western insistence on individual conscience that gradually normalized the idea that belief is personal. Today, many countries, including non-Western, do protect freedom of religion in their constitutions, a direct influence of Western liberal thought and international human rights standards. However, enforcement varies, and in some regions religious persecution or anti-apostasy laws still exist. Western nations often critique these as violations of a fundamental human freedom, reflecting how deeply ingrained the value is in the West. The ability to debate and change one's religious beliefs, or to marry someone of a different faith, or to have a neighborhood where churches, mosques, and temples stand side by side in peace. These are fruits of the Western journey toward religious freedom. This tenet also led to the pluralistic society characteristic of the modern West. It paved the way for communities of diverse faiths to contribute to society equally, and for religion to be a matter of personal identity rather than state identity. Essentially, Western civilization, after much internal bloodshed, concluded that coercion in religion is illegitimate. Faith must be a free choice. That principle has diffused globally as an aspiration and is central to the Western notion of human rights. It sets the West apart from cultures that historically intertwined throne and altar or enforced orthodoxy. In the West, the ideal became a marketplace of religions, just as there is a marketplace of ideas. The resulting religious dynamism, including the freedom to evangelize or not believe at all, is a distinctive feature of Western-influenced modernity, equality before the law. Western civilization embraces the principle of equality before the law, that all individuals, regardless of status, wealth, ethnicity, or gender, are subject to the same laws and have the same legal protections. This ideal took centuries to materialize. Earlier Western societies had estates, nobility, clergy, commoners, with different privileges. But over time, especially through Enlightenment and revolutionary influence, the West established legal egalitarianism as a cornerstone. It is embodied in images like Lady Justice blindfolded, weighing the law impartially. Historical milestones highlight this progression. Roman law introduced the concept of universality of law to citizens, though not to slaves or non-citizens, and Christianity's moral teaching that all souls are equal before God planted seeds questioning rigid hierarchies. The Magna Carta implied the king must respect certain rights of subjects, hinting that even monarchs answer to law. In the Enlightenment era, calls to abolish feudal privileges grew. All men are born and remain free and equal in rights, proclaimed the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, 1789, directly attacking the legal separations of the old regime. Revolutionary France eliminated noble privileges. No more separate courts for aristocrats or tax exemptions for the elite. Similarly, when the United States was founded, it baked into its constitution and later amendments the idea that the law must apply equally to all citizens, though admittedly it took a long struggle to extend that truly to all races and to women. By the late 19th to mid-20th century, Western nations had largely dismantled formal class-based legal differences. Aristocratic titles became ceremonial, not a separate legal class. Citizens of all backgrounds gained the vote and access to public office, and discriminatory laws were progressively removed. For example, Britain's Reform Acts and the abolition of the last rotten boroughs meant law no longer favored the gentry and representation. In the U.S., the Civil War amendments and civil rights movement aimed to make African Americans equal under law, and women's suffrage and feminist movements struck down laws that treated women differently from men, such as coverture laws that made married women legally subsumed by their husbands. Comparative perspective. The ideal of legal equality was not prominent in many other civilizations. India's traditional caste system explicitly prescribed different rules and punishments for different social groups. A Brahmin, for instance, had a very different standing under traditional law than a Dalit. Even today, the legacy of caste means true social equality before law is challenging, though legally caste discrimination is banned, due in part to the influence of modern egalitarian ideals. In feudal Japan, samurai had the right to kill commoners who disrespected them. The law upheld a hierarchy of privilege. In Islamic Sharia, historically, the testimony of a woman counted half that of a man in court, and non-Muslims had a lesser status legally than Muslims. For example, their testimony might not carry equal weight against a Muslim, and they paid a special tax. In China, imperial law distinguished between the elite scholar officials and commoners in terms of punishments for crimes. Sometimes the exam-passing gentry could avoid corporal punishment that commoners would get. Many societies also had slavery or serfdom, where enslaved persons had no legal equality at all. Western civilization was not immune to these inequalities. It had its serfs, slaves, and gender biases. But what stands out is the internal philosophical and political movement to erase them. The concept of universal citizenship with equal rights took root strongly in the West. By the mid-20th century, Western countries were at the forefront of promoting equal rights legislation, e.g., anti-discrimination laws. The notion that justice should be blind to one's identity is a Western legal maxim that has become an international standard largely because of Western influence. Human rights law again echoing it in principle. In practice, of course, inequalities persist and Western societies continue to grapple with de facto disparities, racism, wealth influences, etc. But the crucial point is that legally and officially, Western civilization commits to formal equality. A billionaire and a janitor are supposed to be treated the same by Western courts, and there are frequent examples of high-ranking officials or wealthy individuals being prosecuted, which in some other cultures might be unthinkable due to nepotism or corruption. This principle ties back into rule of law. No one is above the law. It also informs Western political reforms abroad. When writing constitutions for new democracies, Western advisors emphasize equality clauses. The insistence on legal equality has enabled Western societies to integrate waves of immigrants. At least in theory, a new immigrant can become a citizen and enjoy equal rights under law, unlike more rigid societies where outsiders never shed second-class status. It also fuels ongoing social justice movements in the West. Because equality before the law is a baseline expectation, any deviation, racial profiling for example, is seen as a serious violation to be corrected. That reflex to measure reality against the ideal of legal equality is a Western legacy, rooted in its civilization's core values: women's rights and gender equality. Western civilization has undergone a dramatic transformation in the status of women, evolving toward a broad acceptance of gender equality as an ideal. Although all societies had patriarchal roots, the modern women's rights movement largely began in the West and achieved milestones there first, making it a core Western tenet that women and men should have equal legal rights and opportunities. This encompasses women's suffrage, access to education and careers, property and divorce rights, and more recently, equal pay and representation in leadership, areas where the West led the way and continues to push boundaries. Historically, Western women were once legally and socially subordinate. In many places, they couldn't own property independent of a husband, vote, attend universities, or hold public office. The shift began in the Enlightenment when a few voices, like Mary Wollstonecraft in her Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, argued that women are not naturally inferior, but appear so only for lack of education. The 19th century saw organized movements for women's suffrage and rights in Western countries. The Seneca Falls Convention in the U.S. in 1848 issued the Declaration of Sentiments demanding voting rights and equality. Suffragettes in the UK campaigned vigorously, with figures like Emmeline Pankhurst. These efforts bore fruit first in Western settled lands. New Zealand, 1893, and Australia, 1902, were the first to grant women the vote at a national level, followed by parts of the U.S. Some territories/states gave women voting rights before the federal government did in 1920. After World War I, many Western nations enfranchised women: U.S. 1920, UK 1918-1928, Germany 1919, etc. Legal reforms also progressed. For example, by mid-20th century, Western countries had broadly established women's right to work in any profession, to inherit equally, to retain custody of children after divorce, and to generally have the same civic status as men. In the latter half of the 20th century, the women's liberation movement in the West, the second wave feminism of the 1960s and 70s, tackled more subtle inequalities, fighting workplace discrimination, advocating for reproductive rights, like birth control and abortion access, which gave women greater control over their lives, and challenging traditional gender roles. Western societies have since seen women become heads of government: Margaret Thatcher, Angela Merkel, etc., astronauts, CEOs. Virtually every role once deemed for men only. There's still gender disparity, like pay gaps or underrepresentation in top positions, but the open acknowledgement of that problem and efforts to correct it, through policy, activism, or cultural shift, are themselves part of the Western commitment to gender equality. Elsewhere, in comparison, many non-Western societies have been slower to grant women equal rights, often due to deeply entrenched cultural or religious norms. For instance, Switzerland, a Western country, gave women the vote only in 1971, showing even within the West change took time. But looking broadly, Middle Eastern and North African countries largely did not grant women suffrage or equal legal status until the mid-20th century or later, often under Western influence or as part of modernization drives, and some rights, like freedom to dress without a veil or to travel without a male guardian, are still contested in places like Saudi Arabia or Iran. South Asian and East Asian cultures historically confined women to domestic spheres, e.g. Confucian three obediences in China, practices like purdah in India. Many of those countries now have laws for equality, but on-the-ground practice varies widely, and in some rural or conservative areas, women's freedoms remain much more restricted than in the West. For example, in certain regions women still need dowries, can't inherit equally, or face barriers to schooling, issues that Western nations addressed in earlier eras. Western women generally achieved near-equal educational access by the late 19th or early 20th century. Crucially, the global discourse on women's rights largely stems from Western feminist thought and international agreements spearheaded by Western influence, like the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, 1979. Western nations often set standards by already having implemented many of those principles at home. The visual markers of Western women's equality, women in jeans in public, female ministers in governments, co-ed workplaces, stand out to visitors from more traditional societies. It exemplifies how Western civilization has normalized something that historically was exceptional, treating women as full individuals with agency equal to men's. The drive for gender equality in the West is ongoing. Debates on maternity leave, representation, etc., but it's an integral part of Western identity now. Western countries typically rank highest on global gender equality indices. This reflects not that the West is perfect on gender issues, far from it, but that it has made the empowerment of women a conscious societal goal, embedded in law and widely accepted social values. As a core tenet, it distinguishes the West from earlier eras of its own history, and from many other cultures where traditional gender hierarchies still strongly prevail. The idea that women's rights are human rights is a phrase popularized by a Western leader, Hillary Clinton, in 1995. And encapsulates the Western conviction that half of humanity must not be left out of the promise of liberty and equality. Individualism and personal autonomy. Western civilization is markedly individualistic in orientation, meaning it emphasizes the value and rights of the individual person as opposed to the primacy of the group, family, community, or state, in determining identity and decisions. This tenet celebrates personal autonomy, the freedom for individuals to choose their own path in life, their beliefs, their occupation, and generally to be themselves. While all societies recognize individuals, Western culture, especially in modern times, gives the individual an unusual degree of priority in moral and social frameworks. We see this trait in countless Western practices. In Western legal systems, individuals have individual rights protected, free speech, due process, etc., and crimes are seen as offenses against the individual victim or the state, rather than, say, dishonoring a family. Western education encourages students to think critically and form independent opinions. Socially, young Western adults are expected to establish independent lives, moving out of parents' homes relatively early and making choices in career and marriage based on personal inclination, not just family duty. The ideal Western success story is often a self-made person who, through individual talent or effort, rises in society. The American dream is fundamentally individualistic. Western pop culture frequently idolizes the individual hero or the nonconformist who goes against the crowd to follow their own heart. This individualism partly stems from philosophical and religious roots. Christianity introduced the concept of each soul's personal relationship with God and personal salvation, implying individual worth. The Protestant Reformation furthered that by encouraging personal interpretation of Scripture. Enlightenment thought placed the individual's reason and rights at the center. Locke, for instance, starts from individuals in a state of nature consenting to form society. Additionally, some historians, like Joseph Henrich, argue Western Europe's unique kinship structure. The early medieval church's ban on cousin marriage and encouragement of nuclear families broke extended clan ties and fostered a more individual-focused society compared to kin-centric cultures elsewhere. Whatever the causes, by the time of the Industrial Revolution, Western societies were known for weaker extended family bonds and stronger emphasis on individual initiative. E.g., unlike a traditional Chinese household with several generations under one roof and ancestral cult, a Western household was typically just parents and children, with grown children expected to become self-reliant. Comparative outlook. More collectivist cultures, common in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, traditionally emphasize family and community over the individual. In such contexts, key life decisions, like whom to marry, what career to pursue, are often made in consultation with, or even by, the family or community expectations. An individual's behavior is seen as reflecting on the group's honor. For example, in honor-shame cultures, what one person does can bring shame or honor to the entire family or tribe, so personal autonomy is curtailed by collective considerations. In Confucian-influenced societies, the ideal was to fulfill roles and duties within a hierarchy, not to assert one's personal desires against social norms. The Western notion that "I gotta be me," or that each person has a unique destiny to carve out, is less dominant in those contexts. Even today, cross-cultural psychologists find that Westerners, Europeans, North Americans, are more likely to define themselves by personal traits. "I am adventurous. I like books." Whereas people from East Asia might define themselves by relationships. "I am a good son, a loyal employee." Individualism has pros and cons. It fuels creativity, innovation, and individual rights, all Western strengths. But it can also lead to social atomization, weaker extended support networks, and sometimes a sense of alienation. Collectivist societies often have stronger family safety nets but may suppress individual eccentricity or dissent for the sake of harmony. Western civilization has clearly leaned into the individualist side. The fact that Western languages have sayings like "follow your heart" or "march to the beat of your own drum," and these are seen as positive advice, illustrates this value. Laws protecting personal lifestyle choices, whether about religion, speech, sexuality, or career, show that the West expects people will diverge and choose differently, and that's acceptable. Modern Western economies and democracies are built on individualist assumptions. Consumers making individual choices drive markets. Voters choosing according to personal conviction determine leadership. Even Western moral philosophy, like Kant's emphasis on individual moral reasoning, or Mill's focus on individual liberty as long as others are not harmed, underscores the central moral unit as the individual. In contrast, some other ethical systems might prioritize social harmony or filial piety over individual preference. Overall, Western individualism is a defining thread that ties together many other tenets. It underlies why rights are individual, why democracy is one person, one vote, why capitalism trusts individual initiative, why free speech trusts individual discernment, and why social mobility is possible. One isn't strictly bound by family, caste, or class. It sets the West apart from societies that historically placed family lineage, caste, or community consensus at the core of social life. As Western norms have globalized, individualism has spread. But the degree of individual-centric living in the West remains distinctive. This tenet has contributed to Western societies being seen as liberating for personal self-expression, though it also means each person bears great responsibility for their own fate, reflecting the Western belief in personal agency. The nuclear family and monogamous marriage. Western civilization's social structure has long centered on the nuclear family, a unit consisting of parents and their children, and has strongly emphasized monogamous marriage, the union of one husband and one wife at a time. While extended families and other marriage forms exist in the West, the normative model that shaped its laws and culture is the nuclear monogamous family. This is distinctive compared to many other societies historically organized around extended kin groups, or accepting of polygamy. Since classical antiquity and especially under Christian influence, Europe prescribed monogamy. Unlike in parts of Africa, the Middle East, or Asia, a man was not legally or religiously allowed multiple wives. Marriage in Western tradition became ideally a lifetime exclusive partnership, with Christianity raising it to a sacrament. This one-to-one marital norm had several effects. It narrowed the male competition for wives. In polygamous cultures, high-status men might hoard many women, leaving low-status men with none. Monogamy tends to equalize marriage chances. It also meant family property and inheritance would be shared by one set of heirs, simplifying succession compared to polygynous households with many offspring vying. Over time, the Western nuclear family, often neo-local, newlyweds forming a new household rather than staying with extended family, fostered a society where loyalty and financial responsibility were focused on the immediate family unit rather than a large clan. Historically, the Catholic Church enforced rules that broke down extended kin networks. It prohibited cousin marriages and other close kin unions, which in many non-Western societies were common to keep wealth within an extended family. By forcing people to marry outside their kin group and by idealizing a husband-wife bond over clan bonds, medieval Western Christianity inadvertently promoted individual choice in marriage and reduced the dominance of clans. This, as some anthropologists argue, laid groundwork for Western individualism and social structures less centered on large kin groups. Another distinctive feature, the West gradually moved toward marriages based on companionate ideals and romantic love as the primary justification, particularly from the late 18th century onward. While arranged marriages were once common in Europe too, by the modern period, the expectation in Western society is that individuals choose their own spouse based on personal affection, with parental approval being less controlling than in many traditional cultures. This is linked to individualism and the importance of personal happiness. A Western trait. Comparative context. Polygamy, specifically polygyny, one man with multiple wives, was historically practiced across much of the world. Islamic law allows up to 4 wives. Many African societies normalized men taking multiple wives if wealth allowed. In imperial China, official monogamy existed, but emperors and elites kept concubines, effectively a form of polygyny. In such societies, the extended family, including multiple wives, children from each, cousins, etc., was a core economic and social unit. By contrast, in the West, polygamy was illegal and viewed as deviant, except in fringe cases like 19th century Mormonism, which quickly faced pushback leading to outlawing polygamy in the U.S. Extended family living arrangements are still common in many non-Western cultures. Several generations under one roof, joint family systems in South Asia, whereas the West valorized the independent household. Even today, Western seniors often live apart from their grown children, sometimes in retirement communities, whereas in, say, India or the Middle East, it's expected the elderly live with their adult children. These differences stem from the Western focus on the nuclear unit. The nuclear monogamous family model affected Western mobility and social structure. People felt freer to migrate. The family was a small, portable unit not tied into a larger clan network in one locale. It arguably made Western societies more fluid and less clan-oriented. It also placed a lot of emphasis on the marital partnership for emotional support. Hence, Western cultures developed elaborate courtship, and now also significant attention to marital success or issues like divorce. Western nations were among the first to legalize divorce, and later, more recently, same-sex marriage, extending the monogamous ideal to gay couples as well, again emphasizing partnership by choice. In short, while family is important everywhere, the West's conception of what family means, a predominantly nuclear conjugal unit based on a faithful pair bond, is a tenet that shaped its social evolution. It differs from models that prioritize communal living with extended kin, or that permit plural marriage. The Western family ideal has spread through globalization, but in some places it clashes with traditional expectations. For instance, Western media's romantic love narratives versus cultures with arranged marriages. The distinctiveness of the Western approach lies in prioritizing the couple and their children as the fundamental building block of society and legally reinforcing that with monogamy. This structure dovetailed with other Western tenets like individual rights, each person in a marriage seen as having rights and a personal identity, which led to women's rights within marriage, and private property, a nuclear family accumulating and inheriting property without clan redistribution. Thus, the Western nuclear family and monogamy have been central to the civilization's social fabric. Work ethic and entrepreneurship. Western civilization has cultivated a strong work ethic. The view that diligent, disciplined work is virtuous and the key to success, alongside a cultural esteem for entrepreneurship and innovation in business. Often attributed partly to the Protestant work ethic, this tenet manifests as Western society's historic drive for achievement, productivity, and economic growth through individual effort and enterprise. It set Western economies on a dynamic footing and influenced attitudes worldwide. The Protestant Reformation is frequently credited with intensifying the work ethic in northwestern Europe. Sociologist Max Weber famously argued that Calvinist ideas, like the notion of a calling and signs of election by God possibly reflected in one's economic success, led Protestants to value hard work, frugality, and reinvestment, fueling the rise of capitalism. Whether or not one fully buys Weber's thesis, it's true that by the 18th-19th centuries, observers noted that societies like Britain, the Netherlands, and later the United States placed great emphasis on industriousness and self-made prosperity. Being idle or leisure-loving was often morally frowned upon in favor of being, quote, productive. Early to bed, early to rise, as Benjamin Franklin admonished, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. This sums up the Western ideal linking personal virtue and success to work habits. This ethos was tied to economic structures. Western capitalism rewarded innovation and effort. Those who worked hard could start businesses and potentially rise in status, unlike feudal orders where birth fixed your station regardless of effort. Thus, a culture encouraging hustle and ingenuity became entrenched. The Industrial Revolution imposed regimented factory time, which Western workers adapted to, developing habits of punctuality and continuous labor that later economists noted as Western productivity advantages. Meanwhile, Western education systems began inculcating discipline and the value of effort from early on. School and work days in the West tend to be structured and lengthy compared to some other cultures historically reliant on seasonal labor rhythms. Entrepreneurship, taking risks to start new ventures, is another Western hallmark. From merchant adventurers financing voyages in the Age of Discovery to inventors like Thomas Edison or industrialists like Andrew Carnegie, Western lore celebrates the bold individual who creates or finds something new and profits from it. Societies in the West generally admire business success and accept business failure as a learning step. The relatively forgiving Western bankruptcy laws encourage trying again, whereas in some cultures, failing in business could carry heavier stigma or debt bondage. The proliferation of patents and inventors in 19th-century Western countries exemplifies this spirit of enterprise. People were encouraged to try their ideas in the marketplace. This led to rapid technological advancement and economic expansion. In other cultures, many non-Western societies value hard work too. East Asians are often noted for strong work ethic, for instance, but there can be differences in motivation and context. In Confucian East Asia, hard work is tied to duty to family and society. It's collective and academic, exam preparation in nature. In the West, while providing for family is a motive, there's also an individualistic, sometimes competitive angle, working hard for personal achievement and advancement. Some traditional societies placed more emphasis on honor, bravery, or spiritual pursuits over mercantile toil. For example, in pre-modern Europe itself, the aristocracy often disdained manual or commercial work, seeing it fit for commoners. That changed in modern Western culture, where even wealthy entrepreneurs are respected for their work, whereas in some places historically merchants were lower status despite wealth, e.g. under Confucian hierarchy or Indian caste views. Also, climates and economic systems mattered. Certain tropical societies had agricultural cycles with periods of rest, leading colonial Europeans to sometimes misperceive them as lazy, not accounting for climate and crop differences. Western colonizers often tried to instill their work discipline in colonized peoples through mission schools and labor systems, with varying success and much coercion. Over time, Western work ethic globalized with industrial capitalism. Now East Asians often outwork even Westerners in hours and intensity. South Koreans, Japanese have among the longest work hours, blending their discipline with the capitalist drive. But the Western role was pioneering the notion that work itself is a kind of moral fulfillment, the Protestant ethic, and that through industriousness, one can and should better one's earthly condition. This tenet persists. Western children are often taught that they can become anything through hard work, that talent is important, but effort is decisive. Genius is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration, said Edison. The Western business environment encourages initiative. Starting a garage startup is a celebrated trope. Even Western leisure is frequently earned or guilt-tinged if one isn't productive. Phrases like work hard, play hard illustrate the balancing act, but first comes work. In Western politics, unemployment is not just an economic issue, but a moral concern. Leaders speak about the dignity of work and strive for full employment as an ideal. In summary, While a strong work ethic isn't exclusive to the West, the particular valorization of entrepreneurial, self-driven labor for personal betterment is distinctly pronounced in Western tradition. It fed the West's economic rise and still colors Western lifestyles. Consider the relatively low vacation times Americans take compared to Europeans. Even within the West, this ethic varies, but overall Westerners have trended toward a busy, work-focused daily life. This tenet complements others like individualism, capitalism, and progress, all combined to create a culture that often defines a person by their occupation and achievements, and that prizes initiative and perseverance as core virtues. Religious tolerance and pluralism. Western civilization, after centuries of religious strife, gradually adopted religious tolerance as a social ideal and legal norm, giving rise to a pluralistic society where multiple faiths, or none, coexist. This tenet goes beyond the legal freedom of worship, discussed earlier, to a broader cultural acceptance of diversity. Pluralism in the West means not only are different religions allowed, but they are, in principle, respected and can thrive without state bias. Over time, this concept has expanded to include tolerance of differing ethnic cultures, lifestyles, and viewpoints generally, making Western societies among the most diverse and open in the world. Historically, Western Europe was once fiercely intolerant on matters of religion. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the persecution of heretics and witches, the expulsions of Jews, and the bloody Catholic-Protestant wars attest to that. The turn toward tolerance was slow but decisive. The Netherlands in the 17th century was a frontrunner, a relatively tolerant haven for religious dissenters. Descartes and Locke both found refuge in Dutch tolerance. The philosophy of liberalism argued that society is best served when individuals can follow their conscience, and that government should remain neutral in questions of religion. The experiences of countries like the United States, founded as a new nation with a mix of denominations and even non-Christians, encouraged codifying tolerance. The U.S. forbade religious tests for office in its constitution, which was groundbreaking, and welcomed waves of immigrants of all creeds, creating a melting pot. By the 19th century, most Western European states had moved to emancipate religious minorities. Catholics in Protestant majority lands, Protestants in Catholic lands, and Jews almost everywhere were granted equal citizenship. France did so during the Revolution. Other countries followed in the 19th century, though anti-Semitism unfortunately persisted socially. The 20th century further saw Western countries become home to even greater religious variety with immigration from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Places like London, Paris, New York, or Toronto now host large communities of Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, etc., who practice freely. While tensions can arise, the overarching Western commitment is that minority cultures and faiths have a rightful place. In many Western cities, it's routine to see churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues in proximity. Western media and education also promote interfaith dialogue and learning about different traditions as a virtue. Diversity is often celebrated in Western civic discourse, a direct fruit of pluralistic values. This pluralism has few precedents elsewhere historically. Empires like the Ottoman or Mughal did allow multiple religions, but under stratified systems, the millet system or jizya tax for non-Muslims, for example. Often, non-dominant religions were tolerated as second class. In contrast, Western pluralism aims, at least ideally, at equality among different groups in the public square. Secularism in the West created a space where one's religion became a personal identity rather than a political one, allowing multiple identities to share one political community as equals. The Western pluralist model has been a beacon and sometimes a point of contention internationally. For example, debates in Europe about wearing religious symbols like hijabs or crosses, or debates about how to balance individual expression with secular uniformity. But the very fact the debate exists shows a commitment to figuring out pluralism's boundaries rather than defaulting to a single enforced norm. In many non-Western countries, the concept of multicultural society is newer or limited. Some nations have an official religion and little tolerance, e.g., Saudi Arabia disallowing churches. Others may allow diversity, but one group remains clearly dominant culturally, e.g., India is officially secular, but Hindu norms often prevail in public life, and religious tensions flare. The Western idea is that national identity can be decoupled from any single religion or ethnicity. E.g., an American can be of any faith or ethnic background and still be fully American. That civic nationalism plus pluralism combo is quite Western in origin. Western pluralism also extends to ideological pluralism, a tolerance for different political and social viewpoints, which is tied to free speech and democracy. The notion that society is enriched by a variety of perspectives is a Western Enlightenment legacy. Voltaire, Mill, etc. argued for the value of hearing all sides. This is why Western universities and intellectual culture strive aspirationally to include diverse viewpoints and foster debate, and why censorship is suspect. In sum, Western pluralism is the product of learning, sometimes the hard way, that imposing uniformity leads to conflict and stifles progress. Instead, the West chose the path of inclusion, letting myriad flowers bloom in the social garden. This tenet is now espoused as a universal ideal of multiculturalism, but it was Western societies that first attempted it on a large scale in modern times. It distinguishes the West from societies that historically were more insular or homogeneous. While managing pluralism is an ongoing challenge, Western nations still grapple with racism, xenophobia, or integration issues. The open embrace of diversity remains a defining Western principle and is often seen as one of its strengths, fostering creativity, economic dynamism through immigrant contributions, and generally more peaceful coexistence among different groups under shared legal frameworks. Civil society and civic engagement. Western civilization has cultivated a robust civil society, the sphere of voluntary associations, clubs, and organizations that operate independently of the government and family. These range from charities, professional associations and trade unions, to hobby clubs, advocacy groups, and community service organizations. Along with this comes a norm of civic engagement, where individuals actively participate in public life through these associations or local governance. This is a key tenet because it reflects how social cooperation and problem-solving in the West often happen from the bottom up, via citizen initiative, rather than always from top-down state directives or purely through kin networks. Alexis de Tocqueville, writing about America in the 1830s, famously observed that Americans had a tendency to form associations to address collective needs, whether building a schoolhouse, maintaining a church, or campaigning for temperance, rather than waiting for authorities to do it. He saw this as a cornerstone of their democracy, nurturing habits of cooperation, trust, and a sense of empowerment. This propensity was not unique to America. In Britain and other parts of Europe too, the 18th and 19th centuries saw explosions of learned societies, scientific clubs, literary circles, workers' mutual aid societies, and more. Western cities had everything from choral societies and sports clubs to debating societies and volunteer fire brigades. The right of free assembly guaranteed in liberal constitutions protected people's ability to self-organize. This dense network of associations created a buffer between the individual and the state, often called mediating institutions. They fostered social capital, bonds of trust and cooperation, which made Western societies more resilient and responsive. For example, if there was a social problem, poverty, illiteracy, often a philanthropist or a voluntary organization, like Barnardo's Homes for Orphans in Victorian Britain or settlement houses in the U.S., would step in even before the state did. These organizations could also advocate politically, laying groundwork for reforms, abolitionist societies against slavery, suffragist leagues for women's voting rights, etc. The Western tradition of free civic association is one reason why reform and innovation could happen relatively quickly. Concerned citizens could band together to experiment with solutions and pressure authorities. Comparatively, in more hierarchical or authoritarian societies, such independent civic space was minimal or controlled. For instance, in Imperial China, there were guilds and lineage groups, but any political association was suspect. The state didn't allow independent organizations that could challenge it. Even today, the communist government tightly restricts NGOs and requires they be registered under government supervision. In Tsarist Russia, there was a weak tradition of civic association outside the Orthodox Church and peasant communes. Attempts to form liberal associations were often viewed as subversive. Colonial regimes often discouraged natives from forming political organizations for fear of rebellion, whereas colonizers introduced some Western-style clubs and societies among the elites. Many traditional societies relied on extended family or caste/clan networks for mutual aid, rather than broad voluntary groups including unrelated individuals. Those clan networks were strong internally, but could breed inter-clan distrust. The Western model brought people together across kin lines for shared interests or causes, broadening social trust circles. The ethic of volunteerism is a related Western trait. Americans, in particular, are known for high rates of volunteering and charitable giving, reflecting that belief that citizens should contribute time and resources to community betterment, not just pay taxes and expect the government to do everything. This harks back to a Tocquevillian spirit, and even earlier. Benjamin Franklin organized the first volunteer fire department, libraries, and civic improvements in 18th C Philadelphia, long before any city government took on such roles. Moreover, civic education in the West reinforces this. Western democracies encourage civic participation, like voting, jury duty, community service requirements in schools, etc. The assumption is that a healthy republic requires engaged citizens, not passive subjects. This mindset was not as emphasized in more autocratic cultures, where loyalty and obedience were stressed over initiative. The strong civil society of the West is credited with helping check government power, through watchdog groups, independent press organizations, etc., integrate minorities, immigrant associations helping newcomers, and respond to crises, neighbor helping neighbor, plus NGOs leaping into action. When Eastern Europe shook off communism in 1989, one of the tasks was to rebuild civil society, create independent unions, clubs, and NGOs, because those had been suppressed. They looked to Western models for that. In summary, the Western tenet of civil society means people don't see themselves only as subjects under authority, but as members of a community who can organize themselves to pursue common interests. It's a facet of the broader Western value of liberty, freedom not just to do as one pleases individually, but to collectively assemble and act. This has made Western societies quite vibrant and adaptable, as innovation and change can bubble up from civil society without needing state initiation. Even in the digital age, one sees this in Western contexts. From open-source software communities to social media movements, Westerners readily self-organize in novel ways, reflecting that ingrained habit of civic engagement, meritocracy, and social mobility. Western civilization in modern times has aspired to be a meritocracy, a society where individuals advance based on talent, effort, and achievement, rather than on the status of their birth. This goes hand in hand with the ideal of social mobility, the ability for people to move up or down the social and economic ladder irrespective of their origins. While no society is perfectly meritocratic, the West led in dismantling rigid hereditary class systems and creating pathways for self-made success, or at least the widely held belief that such mobility is possible. In medieval Europe, feudal structure meant your birth, noble, clerical, or common, largely determined life outcomes. Over the centuries, especially after the Enlightenment and revolutions, Western nations progressively removed legal barriers to mobility. Feudal privileges were abolished, like nobility exclusive rights. Education was open to broader populations. The rise of public schooling and universities meant a smart youth from a poor family had a better chance to gain skills to rise. The cultural narrative shifted. Success stories of individuals rising from humble beginnings became celebrated, e.g., Benjamin Franklin's journey from apprentice to statesman, or Andrew Carnegie from bobbin boy to steel magnate. This contrasted with older stories where heroes were often of royal blood. The establishment of competitive exams for civil service was a hallmark of Western meritocratic reform. Britain, for example, introduced exams to enter the civil service in the 19th century, inspired partly by the Chinese exam system, interestingly, replacing patronage, so a middle-class, non-aristocratic person could become a high-ranking official by passing exams unheard of in earlier eras. The U.S., after initial spoils system corruption, instituted civil service exams too. Pendleton Act 1883. Universities in the West also moved toward open entrance based on examinations and academic merit by the 20th century, rather than being preserve of the aristocracy. Economically, capitalism itself, as embraced in the West, allowed for some rags-to-riches mobility. A person with a good idea or strong work ethic could start a business and prosper without needing noble lineage. Contrast with pre-capitalist societies where land ownership tied to nobility was primary wealth. American culture in particular became synonymous with the American dream, the idea that anyone, through hard work and talent, could rise from poverty to wealth. This wasn't a guaranteed reality for everyone, but it was a potent motivating ethos, distinct from caste-bound or class-bound worldviews elsewhere. Many societies had far more stratified structures. India's caste system is a prime example of a system antithetical to meritocracy. It fixed occupations and social standing by birth, historically making mobility nearly impossible. A low-caste genius could not become a Brahmin scholar traditionally. Europe under aristocracies also had similar issues before modernization. Europe's change was that it upended that earlier than others. In East Asia, Imperial China had an element of meritocracy with its civil service exams. But even that was limited to males who could afford years of classical study, and the highest offices still often went to those with connections. Also, outside the officialdom, merchants or artisans had social ceilings. A brilliant merchant in Confucian society might gain wealth but not social prestige to match. The West's embrace of commerce and later of professional careers opened additional avenues for talented individuals to gain status beyond government roles. Think of renowned Western scientists, artists, or entrepreneurs who gained high esteem regardless of humble origins. E.g., Michael Faraday, a bookbinder's son turned great scientist. Post-World War II, Western nations worked to reduce barriers to mobility further by expanding higher education massively. The GI Bill in the U.S., opening universities to working class via scholarships, etc., promoting a culture where elite positions, doctors, lawyers, corporate executives, were theoretically open to anyone with the ability to pursue the needed training. The concept of fair competition is key. Western sports, for instance, embody meritocracy. In Olympic trials or leagues, anyone good enough makes the team. That sports ethos carries into other domains, awarding jobs or promotions based on performance, not nepotism. Though of course nepotism still exists, the ideal is to minimize it. Meritocracy is by no means perfectly realized in the West. Critiques point out persistent inequalities, the way wealthy families still secure advantages, elite schooling, networking. However, the difference is that Western discourse acknowledges those as problems to fix in order to live up to the ideal. For example, when universities or corporations notice lack of diversity, they implement measures, like outreach or even affirmative action in some contexts, to try to ensure that talent from all backgrounds gets a fair shot. An effort motivated by the belief that society should not waste talent due to prejudice or structural bias. In contrast, in societies where hierarchy is more accepted, such interventions might not be a priority. For instance, until recently, Japan had more rigid seniority-based corporate cultures, and Europe itself had vestiges of classism. Yet Western trends in late 20th century have been to continually break glass ceilings. Women in traditionally male roles, minorities in leadership positions, etc. Always pushing the notion that roles should be open to those who earn them by merit. Thus, Western civilization's orientation to meritocracy has been a driving force in its dynamism, encouraging people to develop their abilities and innovate, confident that they might be rewarded. It also ties morally to Western egalitarian ideals, that every person should have the opportunity to fulfill their potential. The social mobility that results, while not perfect, Western societies do generally have higher mobility than historically caste-bound ones, lends a certain optimism and social fluidity to Western culture. People are not permanently stuck where they start, a narrative proven by countless Western biographies, from Abraham Lincoln to modern tech entrepreneurs. That belief in mobility through merit is deeply ingrained in Western identity and policy, e.g., anti-discrimination laws, public education for all, etc., are all to foster a meritocratic playing field. It marks a departure from more static traditional orders and is a key ingredient in the Western story of progress, tradition of critique and reform. Western civilization has a notable tradition of self-critique and reform, a tendency to question its own foundations and to attempt to correct injustices or errors through reasoned debate and institutional change. Far from being static, Western culture has been in continual conversation with its past, often critically re-evaluating beliefs and practices. This propensity to challenge authority and orthodoxies, even those within Western tradition itself, is a driving engine of Western intellectual and social evolution. We can see this trait as far back as the classical Greeks with Socrates, who famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living," and went around Athens questioning people's assumptions, ultimately paying with his life, but setting an example of critical inquiry. Fast forward to the Renaissance humanists, who critiqued the scholasticism of the medieval church and revived antiquity's lessons to reform education and art. The Reformation was Westerners critiquing their own church's practices and doctrines, leading to massive changes in Christianity. The Enlightenment was essentially a broad critique of established superstition, feudal privilege, and absolute monarchy, and it gave rise to revolutions that reformed society on new principles. Each cycle of Western history includes voices saying, "We have gone astray here. Let's rethink this." This internal critique isn't purely destructive. It's coupled with a faith in reform, that by identifying flaws, Western societies can take deliberate steps to improve. For example, abolitionists in Britain and America, late 18th, early 19th centuries, pointed out the glaring contradiction between Western ideals of liberty and the practice of slavery. Through moral campaigns, political lobbying, and even war in the U.S., the Western world largely abolished slavery, a huge self-correction. Similarly, the women's suffrage movement had women and men openly criticizing the democratic West for half hypocrisy, preaching democracy while half the population couldn't vote, until reforms were made. The civil rights movement in the U.S. later held America to account for failing its promise of equality for black citizens, leading to legislative and social changes. These are instances of a culture essentially calling itself out and striving to do better, often successfully. Philosophically, Western thought encourages critique via methods like the scientific method, which inherently involves questioning and testing hypotheses, even overturning long-held scientific theories in light of new evidence, and via dialectic in philosophy, the idea that through debate, thesis, antithesis, one arrives at a synthesis or deeper truth. There's a line from medieval disputations to modern peer review. Knowledge advances by critical scrutiny of existing knowledge. Even Western literature and art often take a critical lens. Think of Cervantes satirizing chivalry in Don Quixote, or modern novelists critiquing social norms, or painters like Goya or Picasso confronting the horrors of war. Compared to many other civilizations historically, the West has been unusually prone to institutionalized self-criticism. The existence of an opposition in parliament, freedom of press exposing government failures, academic freedom to challenge prevailing theories, all these ensure that critique isn't just a rebellious undercurrent, but part of the system. Not to say other cultures lack critics or reformers, they have them, but Western civilization made critique something of an institution. The result is an almost iterative improvement process, e.g., Western legal systems allow appellate courts to review and overturn wrong decisions. Western economies allow old companies to fail and new ones to disrupt markets. Creative destruction, as economists say. Perhaps because of this, Western societies have shown notable capacity for course correction. After the extreme of Nazism and fascism, which were themselves rejections of liberal Western values, the Western world after World War II deeply critiqued those ideologies, leading to strong commitments to human rights, democracy, and international cooperation to prevent such horrors again. After colonialism, many Western intellectuals and politicians critiqued imperialism itself and pushed for decolonization and apology/repair efforts to former colonies. While the legacy is complex, the key is that Westerners didn't only wait for outsiders to condemn them. Many from within raised the moral questions and pushed changes. E.g., the British anti-colonial voices like Orwell, or French existentialists opposing the Algerian War. This self-critical nature sometimes gives the impression of Western cultural introspection or even cultural guilt. Often Western media and scholarship are very frank about Western historical wrongs, slavery, colonial atrocities, etc., incorporating those critiques into education and discourse. That frankness is itself a Western trait. Many nations prefer heroic narratives and downplay dark episodes, whereas Western historians and activists often shine light on them to learn and improve. In summary, Western civilization's capacity to identify problems, be they moral contradictions, social injustices, scientific errors, and mobilize efforts to reform, has been a powerful engine of its development. It is how the West moved from absolute monarchies to democracies, from theocratic control to secular freedoms, from entrenched inequality to more inclusive rights, each step driven by internal critiques and reformist movements. This makes Western culture unusually dynamic, always somewhat restless, striving towards ideals it sets for itself and adjusting when it falls short. It's a cultural DNA of not taking the status quo as untouchable. The ethos that no idea or institution is beyond questioning, even fundamentals, is very much a Western tenet and ties back to the legacy of Socratic inquiry and Enlightenment skepticism. Competition and innovation. A salient feature of Western civilization is its embrace of competition in economics, politics, and even ideas as a means to spur innovation and excellence. Western societies often structure systems so that individuals or entities vie against each other, believing that this rivalry yields better outcomes, better products, more efficient governance, technological breakthroughs for society at large. This competitive drive, balanced by rules and fair play, is deeply ingrained and has been a catalyst for Western advancements. In the economic realm, Western capitalism is inherently competitive. Companies compete in markets to attract consumers, driving them to innovate or offer better value. Historically, the fragmented political landscape of Europe, numerous nation-states in close proximity, meant states also competed for power, trade, and prestige. Unlike a large unified empire like Imperial China under one ruler, Europe's many kings, princes, and city republics constantly pushed each other. This has been cited as a reason for the West's rapid progress. If one nation suppressed a new idea or invention, another might adopt it to gain an edge, as when the Italian Renaissance innovations spread to receptive places like France or Germany, or when religious dissenters fled to more tolerant neighboring countries bringing talent and ideas. Competition between European powers drove global exploration. The rivalry of Spain versus Portugal, then others joining, and later the industrial race. Britain industrialized, others rushed to catch up. Even Western science has competitive elements. Scientists strive to make discoveries and earn recognition. Prizes like the Nobel are emblematic of formalized competition for achievement. Western universities historically competed for eminence. Oxford versus Cambridge friendly rivalry, for example, which can drive academic standards up. In the arts, cities and patrons competed. Renaissance city-states each wanted the best artists, fueling an artistic boom. Western politics, after democratization, became competitive via multi-party elections. Parties and candidates compete for votes, which ideally keeps them responsive to citizens. If they perform poorly, competitors will replace them. This stands in contrast to one-party states or monarchies where power is uncontested, and thus there's less immediate pressure to perform well or innovate in policy. Sports are another reflection. The West elevated sports into organized competitions. The Olympic Games were revived by the West in 1896. Professional sports leagues are a huge part of Western culture. The values of sportsmanship and fair contest parallel how Westerners approach business and other domains, compete hard, but by agreed rules. And competition is seen as a healthy way to channel aggression and strive for improvement. Comparatively, some other civilizations historically valued harmony or stability over competition. Confucian ideology, for instance, emphasized hierarchical harmony. Competition was not highlighted as a virtue. Civil service exams were competitive in China, but business and politics were more about maintaining order and following precedent than outdoing others in dramatic ways. Many indigenous cultures prioritized communal sharing and collaboration over competition. Though intertribal conflict could be intense, internal economics were often more cooperative. The Western push to constantly grow, beat rivals, and seek new things can sometimes perplex or disturb more stability-oriented cultures. Of course, competition can have downsides. Western industrial competition contributed to colonial imperialism and arms races, for example. But Western civilization has often managed to turn competition into a regulated game that fosters progress. Market competition spurred the incredible pace of Western technological and economic growth. Political competition via checks and balances prevented stagnation or tyranny. Intellectual debate, essentially competition of ideas, refined Western knowledge systems. The Cold War can even be seen as a competitive spur. The US and USSR space race led to the moon landing, a dramatic innovation partly driven by rivalry. Though dangerous, that competition accelerated tech development. satellites, computers, with peaceful applications later. Western legal and cultural frameworks try to ensure competition doesn't devolve into destructive conflict, hence antitrust laws to keep economic competition fair, electoral laws to keep politics fair, and rules of sportsmanship or academic integrity. The ideal is that competition produces winners, but not at the total expense of losers. Losers can try again or innovate further in an ongoing cycle. This competitive spirit is visible at the individual level too. Western educational and career paths often involve a series of competitive selections, exams, job interviews, performance reviews. The culture encourages people to distinguish themselves, which ties to individualism, but within a framework of merit. Back to meritocracy. Many Western proverbs and practices revolve around healthy competition. Competition brings out the best in people, or using games and contests as learning tools for children. In summary, Western civilization's competitive ethos, when balanced with its other tenets like rule of law and pluralism, has been a powerful engine for innovation. It has pushed Western societies to never remain complacent. Businesses strive to outdo each other inventing new gadgets. Scientists race to publish first. Politicians hustle to deliver results before the next election, etc. This constant push generates a dynamic where change is normal and improvement is pursued. It sets Western culture apart from more static or centrally planned systems, and it's been one of the reasons Western nations historically surged ahead in various fields. The challenge is always to keep competition constructive, not violent or excessively unequal, something the West addresses through laws and norms. But the core belief that competition, under the right conditions, is beneficial and leads to progress is distinctly Western and remains a guiding principle in everything from Western economies to its educational philosophy and entertainment. Mass education and literacy. Western civilization was the first to implement mass education, the widespread provision of formal schooling to the general population, including children of all social classes and both sexes. This commitment to universal literacy and schooling, at least at the primary level, has been a foundational Western tenet since the 18th-19th centuries, and is tied to its values of individual empowerment, meritocracy, and progress. An educated citizenry is seen as essential for informed democracy, productive economy, and personal fulfillment. The roots of this can be traced to the Protestant Reformation. Protestants emphasized that everyone should read the Bible personally, which drove leaders like Martin Luther to advocate schooling for all, including girls, a relatively new idea at the time. Some Protestant regions of Europe, like parts of Germany and Scandinavia, achieved high literacy rates early, by 18th century, due to church-driven schooling. In secular terms, Enlightenment philosophers also stressed education as a means to better society. Condorcet in France envisioned all citizens educated to reason. The Industrial Revolution created further demand for literate, trainable workers and informed citizens, which spurred governments to invest in public education. By the late 19th century, most Western countries had instituted compulsory elementary education. For example, Prussia led the way with state-sponsored primary schools in the early 1800s, which became a model. England passed the Education Acts in the 1870s. The U.S. had common schools in many states by the mid-19th century. This was significantly ahead of many other parts of the world where education remained limited to elites or informal apprenticeships. Western societies also built extensive networks of secondary schools, high schools, and expanded universities. The idea that even the rural poor should be taught to read, write, and do arithmetic, and often beyond that, history, science basics, literature of their nation, was a novel concept historically. It reflects Western faith in progress and individual potential. Education became a great equalizer and pathway for social mobility. The results were dramatic. By early 20th century, Western populations were largely literate, whereas vast segments of populations in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East were not yet. This literacy allowed Western publics to consume newspapers, books, and participate in the national discourse, further reinforcing other Western tenets, like free speech and democracy. A literate electorate is crucial for functional democracy. It also underpinned Western scientific and technological advance, since broad education provided a large talent pool for higher learning and innovation. Western education was not just about technical skills. It carried a cultural mission of instilling national identity and shared civic values. For instance, French schools, taught the French language over regional dialects and secular republican values. American schools taught patriotism and the principles of the Constitution. This created more cohesive nations out of previously regional or segmented communities, a Western approach to nation-building through education. Comparatively, traditional education in other civilizations was often restricted. In feudal societies globally, peasants rarely got formal schooling. In imperial China, education was valued, but mostly for boys aiming for civil service. The average peasant or merchant's literacy was not a state priority. Though some basic village schooling existed, it wasn't universal. In colonial eras outside the West, missionary and colonial schools started expanding education. But even by mid-20th century, many newly independent countries had large, illiterate populations to catch up on educating. The Western idea of the state funding and mandating primary education for every child was eventually adopted worldwide because it proved indispensable for modern development. But it originated in Western reforms. Mass education in the West also increasingly included education for girls, which was revolutionary. By late 19th century, girls in Western Europe and America were commonly attending primary and sometimes secondary school. The first women's colleges were founded in the mid-1800s, e.g., Mount Holyoke 1837, Girton College at Cambridge 1869. And by the early 20th century, co-education or parallel institutions meant Western women gained access to higher education broadly, something that took much longer elsewhere or is still lacking in parts. Educating women contributed enormously to social change, lower birth rates, women entering professions, etc. Again, a Western-led phenomenon. This tenet of mass education shows Western belief in rationality and improvement. If everyone is educated, society as a whole benefits from more informed citizens, a more skilled workforce, and fewer superstitions or ignorance. It ties to humanism, value of human mind, and equality. Everyone deserves an education. It also fuels economic growth. Economists cite Western human capital, literacy/education, as key to its industrial revolution and ongoing innovation. Today, this legacy means Western countries have extensive public school systems, libraries in even small towns, and a culture that heavily emphasizes formal education in youth. Debates about school curricula or student loans are central in Western politics because education is taken as critical infrastructure. The notion that a child from a poor family should have access to the same quality of education as one from a rich family, even if not fully realized, it's an ideal that drives policy like free public schools or scholarship programs, is very much a Western value about leveling the playing field through knowledge. In summary, Western civilization's early commitment to mass literacy and schooling is a pillar of its success and distinct identity. It empowered ordinary people in unprecedented ways and created a feedback loop. Educated citizens drive progress, which then demands even more advanced education, and so on. This emphasis on enlightenment, small e for the masses, is captured in images like the Little Red Schoolhouse in every American town, or the motto of many Western universities about light, truth, knowledge for all. It contrasts with histories where knowledge was guarded by elites, or denied to segments of society. Western tenet holds that knowledge should be broadly disseminated, a profoundly transformative stance that the rest of the world eventually adopted as well, under Western influence and their own drive to modernize. Secular ethics and humanism. In Western civilization, alongside religious moral traditions, a strong current of secular ethics emerged, a framework for determining right and wrong based on reason, human well-being, and philosophical principles rather than divine commandments. This ties into the broader movement of humanism, which places human interests and values at the center. Essentially, the West developed the idea that one can live a moral, meaningful life and build a just society guided by human reason and empathy alone, irrespective of religious doctrine. This tenet became especially prominent from the Enlightenment onward and underpins many modern Western institutions that are neutral or independent of any particular religion. Courts, universities, hospitals serve people of all creeds equally, guided by universal ethics. One can trace precursors in classical philosophy. Aristotle's virtue ethics, or Stoic notions of natural law accessible to reason, were non-theistic approaches to morality that influenced the West. During the Enlightenment, philosophers like Immanuel Kant proposed ethical systems, e.g., the categorical imperative, that did not rely on God, but on logical consistency and the intrinsic dignity of rational beings. Utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill argued for judging actions by their consequences for human happiness, the greatest good for the greatest number. Again, a secular yardstick. These ideas allowed Western societies to find common moral ground despite pluralism. One need not share the same religion to agree that, say, unnecessary suffering is bad or justice requires fairness. These can be debated and justified through secular reasoning. Humanism in the West also has Renaissance roots. Thinkers then revived the idea from earlier Greek and Roman sources that human life and achievements on Earth have value in themselves, not just as preparation for afterlife. Over time, Western culture grew more this worldly in its ethical focus, concerned with alleviating human suffering, improving living conditions, expanding knowledge and rights, all for human sake here and now. This doesn't mean Westerners are less spiritual or ethical. Rather, even many Western religious people accept secular ethics in civic life, understanding that public policy should be argued on grounds everyone can appreciate, like human rights, public good, rather than sectarian ones. The development of international human rights law itself is a product of secular humanist thinking that all humans have certain rights by virtue of their humanity. While rooted in Western natural rights philosophy, which had deistic assumptions historically, modern human rights discourse is typically framed in secular terms and championed by Western-influenced global bodies, UN, etc. Concepts like medical ethics. Doctors should treat patients by standards of evidence and compassion, not religious rules. And legal ethics, justice blind to person status, are part of this secular moral tradition. In contrast, in societies where religion pervaded all aspects of life, law and morality were often inseparable from theology. E.g., Sharia law in Islamic contexts defines moral, social, and legal rules. Or in Hindu society, dharma was tied to cosmic/religious order. The West used to be like that. Medieval Europe's morality was heavily religious, but the shift to secular ethics meant you could have a cohesive society despite having multiple religions or none at all, by appealing to shared human values. This is at the heart of Western separation of church and state. The state derives its legitimacy not from upholding one true religion's moral code, but from protecting the welfare and rights of all people regardless of religion. This humanist approach also emboldened criticism of traditions found harmful when examined through a human welfare lens. For instance, Western societies banned practices like torture or cruel punishments, initially for religious reasons, Christian compassion, but later solidified by secular Enlightenment arguments. Beccaria's famous treatise against torture and death penalty, 1764, appealed to reason and humanity. Similarly, Western animal welfare concerns grew not strictly from religious commandment, though there's influence of the biblical stewardship concept, but from philosophical arguments about suffering. Jeremy Bentham's, "The question is not can they reason, but can they suffer?" about animals. Secular humanism became so ingrained that even Western religious institutions often engage with secular morality. For example, a church might argue against abortion or poverty in terms of human rights and well-being in public debate, not only quoting scripture to appeal to all. Conversely, purely secular movements, like environmentalism or humanitarian aid organizations, often carry almost spiritual passion, but expressed in universal terms of saving the planet or alleviating human suffering. This tenet doesn't mean Westerners are less moral. Rather, morality is often discussed in a common language accessible to believers and non-believers alike. It underlies multi-faith democracies where, say, laws about theft or violence are justified by protecting people, not because a particular scripture forbids them, even if that's also true. It also liberates personal conscience. A Westerner may decide their stance on, say, euthanasia or free speech by considering human consequences and principles like autonomy, rather than strictly by religious decree. That freedom of moral thought is part of Western individualism and intellectual tradition. Notably, Western countries have significant populations that identify as secular or non-religious, yet they largely adhere to strong ethical norms, showing that morality has been successfully grounded in secular human values. For instance, Scandinavian nations are among the least religious and yet high in measures of societal health, low corruption, strong social trust, indicating secular ethics viability. In summary, Western civilization normalized the idea that one can be a moral person and create a moral society using reason, empathy, and shared human values as a guide. This tenet allowed Western pluralism to function. Diverse people can agree on core ethics without sharing religion, and encouraged continuous ethical evolution. We can debate ethics openly and change norms. E.g., attitudes on gender equality or LGBT rights shifted due to humanistic reasoning about fairness and harm. It's a hallmark of the modern West that morality is often deliberated in parliament or court or public forums through rational discourse, not just decreed by religious authority. This secular humanist tradition complements Western scientific rationality and political liberalism, anchoring them in a concern for human welfare as the ultimate goal. Private property and contract rights. Another fundamental tenet of Western civilization is the strong protection of private property and enforcement of contracts. Western legal systems have long upheld an individual's right to acquire, own, and transfer property without arbitrary interference, and insisted that agreements, contracts, freely made, should be honored and can be enforced by courts. This respect for property and contracts underpins Western economic development, enabling capitalism, investment, and credit, and ties into values of individual liberty and rule of law. The sanctity of property in the West has deep roots in Roman law, dominium, ownership rights, and was reinforced by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, who famously argued that property rights are natural rights derived from one's labor and that protecting property is one of government's primary roles. In medieval Europe, while feudal arrangements complicated absolute ownership for serfs, cities and emerging nation-states gradually recognized clearer property rights. For instance, the Magna Carta included some protections against seizure of property by the king. By the early modern period, Western countries were establishing that not even the sovereign could arbitrarily take a subject's property without legal process. The English Bill of Rights, 1689, forbade the crown from levying taxes or confiscating property without parliamentary consent. This created a climate where individuals felt secure investing in land, businesses, or goods, knowing they had legal title backed by the courts. Contract rights similarly evolved. Western commerce flourished on the basis of trust in contracts, whether it was merchants in the Hanseatic League trading across Europe, or colonial companies like the Dutch and British East India Companies using complex contracts and joint stock arrangements. The development of reliable contract law and mechanisms like negotiable instruments, insurance contracts, etc., in Western Europe made it easier for people to engage in transactions and extended trade over long distances or durations. If someone reneged on a deal, Western courts would compel fulfillment or compensation, which reduced the risk of trade significantly. By the 19th century, Western countries often had nearly uniform national legal codes, like the Napoleonic Code in civil law countries or common law precedents in England/America, that meticulously delineated property and contract law. This allowed formation of corporations, mortgages on property, patents on intellectual property, all forms of property that drove innovation and entrepreneurship. It also facilitated credit markets. One could take a loan using property as collateral because lenders trusted the legal system to enforce repayment or claim collateral if needed. In contrast, in many non-Western societies historically, property was more communally held, e.g., tribal lands, or at the whim of rulers, e.g., the Ottoman Empire technically owned all land, granting usage rights to subjects which could be revoked. Even where private property existed, the lack of clear legal systems sometimes made enforcement weak. For instance, in Qing China, commerce thrived, but merchants often relied on kin or guild networks for contract enforcement rather than courts, because legal recourse was uncertain and the state prioritized agriculture over commerce. Economist Hernando de Soto famously argued that one reason Western economies advanced faster was because Western legal systems turned dead capital, e.g., informal property holdings, into live capital by formalizing property rights, whereas many developing nations still struggle with informal property lacking legal recognition, making it hard to use as collateral or sell transparently. The Western concept of property goes beyond land. It extends to one's own person, bodily autonomy, one's creations, intellectual property like copyrights, which Western law strongly protects, and one's business assets, Limited liability companies allowed people to invest without risking all personal property, encouraging more risk-taking in enterprise. This emphasis on property rights correlates with the Western value of individual freedom. Owning property gives individuals independence from feudal lords or the state. For example, widespread land ownership in the U.S. through homesteading, etc., helped create a culture of self-reliance. It also supports political liberty. Historically, those with property often demanded a say in governance. Hence, early suffrage was tied to property, though eventually suffrage expanded as a right of all individuals. Moreover, Western societies often saw contract enforcement as a matter of justice. If two parties agreed, it was morally right they be held to it, tying into the rule of law principle that the law is a neutral arbiter of voluntary arrangements. This tenet does not mean other cultures lacked regard for property or promises, but Western civilization systematized it and integrated it strongly into its legal fabric earlier and more deeply. That created a predictable environment, fueling capitalist growth. When non-Western countries modernized, a key step was often reforming land laws. E.g., Japan's Meiji Restoration introduced Western-style property rights to dismantle feudal domains, and adopting Western commercial codes to facilitate contracts and foreign investment. Continuation. Western emphasis on secure property and contracts contrasts with systems where property might be collective or subject to a ruler's whim. By codifying ownership and honoring agreements, Western economies built a foundation for entrepreneurial risk-taking and long-term investment. A farmer will improve land if he knows it's truly his. A merchant will send goods overseas if he trusts the contract will be enforced. This tenet also ties into personal liberty. Private property gives individuals a sphere of autonomy, and reliable contracts allow them to arrange their affairs freely. Together, strong property and contract rights made Western civilization uniquely conducive to commerce, credit, and the complex transactions of a modern economy, fueling its prosperity and empowering individuals in everyday life. Mastery of nature and scientific dominance. Western civilization developed a distinct attitude of mastering nature, harnessing and controlling natural forces for human benefit. While other cultures often sought harmony with nature, Western thought, especially since the scientific revolution, aimed to analyze, use, and transform nature through science and technology. This drive is evident from the early modern period. Francis Bacon wrote of putting nature on the rack to extract her secrets, and René Descartes spoke of making humans, quote, masters and possessors of nature. Western societies avidly applied discoveries to practical ends, from improving agriculture with mechanization to conquering distance with railroads and airplanes. This tenet led to the Western-led Industrial Revolution, which dramatically expanded humanity's ability to exploit resources, coal, oil, and to reshape environments, canals, dams, urban development. It also spurred invention after invention. Western engineers and scientists developed electricity, engines, synthetic chemicals, medical cures, all tools to reduce reliance on nature's whims. Electric light freeing people from day-night cycle, vaccines taming diseases that once seemed like acts of God. The West's confidence in progress, another tenet, fed this cycle. Each generation expected to have more control over material conditions than the last. As a result, Westerners achieved feats once unthinkable, mapping the genome, splitting the atom, traveling to the moon, exemplifying how far this impulse to master nature could go. Contrasting worldviews. Many indigenous and Eastern philosophies emphasize living in balance with natural cycles, e.g., Taoism's principle of Wu Wei, non-interference. For millennia, societies adjusted to nature, monsoon rhythms, reliance on seasonal rains, rather than fundamentally altering ecosystems. In Europe, though, the challenge of harsh winters and limited land perhaps encouraged technical solutions, windmills, crop rotation, to wring more from nature. Moreover, Judeo-Christian tradition gave a mandate to subdue the earth, Genesis, which some interpret as license for dominion over nature, tempered by stewardship ideals. In any case, Western culture by the 19th-20th centuries exhibited an unparalleled faith in technology to overcome natural limits, building ever-taller skyscrapers, digging through mountains for railways, eradicating pests, and boosting crop yields with fertilizers and GMOs. This mastery of nature tenet brought immense benefits, productivity, comfort, population growth, but also side effects like environmental degradation and climate change. problems Western societies are now among the first to scientifically identify and attempt to solve, ironically using more technology, like renewable energy and geoengineering debates. Thus, the Western penchant to control nature continues in efforts to mitigate the unintended consequences of earlier control. Western civilization today leads in environmental science and policy, in large part because it has both the responsibility, having industrialized first, and the technical capacity to address global issues. Fundamentally, this Western trait of seeing nature as something to understand rationally and manipulate gave humanity tremendous power. It reflects Western confidence in human reason and agency. Where other cultures might perform rituals for rain, Western farmers studied weather patterns and built irrigation systems. Where disease was seen as fate elsewhere, Westerners developed germ theory and pharmaceuticals. This tenet underlies Western dominance in science and technology for centuries and shapes a world in which humans increasingly engineer ecosystems, for better or worse. As Western thought permeates globally, the mastery of nature ethos becomes a human ethos. Though there's growing Western introspection about blending it with respect for nature, birth of modern environmentalism in the West shows the culture can critique itself and seek a new balance, another Western trait. In sum, Western civilization's proactive stance toward nature, viewing it as comprehensible matter and energy to be harnessed, is a hallmark that enabled its rapid development and many comforts of modern life. It marks a departure from more fatalistic or equilibrium-focused views and propelled humanity into the Anthropocene epoch, largely via Western initiative. Even as the West now champions sustainable practices, it does so through human-centric innovation, electric cars, solar farms, rather than a return to pre-modern passive acceptance. This relentless pursuit of mastery is both a defining strength of the West and a challenge it now endeavors to channel responsibly. Personal responsibility and individual accountability. Western culture places strong emphasis on personal responsibility, the idea that individuals are accountable for their choices and actions, and that with freedom comes the duty to use it responsibly. This tenet manifests in Western legal and social norms that treat people as autonomous agents rather than mere members of a group or subjects of fate. It encourages traits like self-discipline, reliability, and accountability, which have been crucial in Western civic and economic life. In Western societies, the narrative often is that one's life outcomes, while influenced by circumstance, are significantly shaped by one's own decisions and effort. This is seen in Proverbs. God helps those who help themselves, popularized by Benjamin Franklin, and in social attitudes that praise those who pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Western legal systems embody this by judging crime on an individual basis. Guilt is personal. Western courts don't punish a criminal's family or caste, whereas in some tribal or honor-based cultures, collective punishment or feud might occur. If someone commits wrongdoing, Western ethics stress they should accept blame and face consequences, hence the value placed on honesty, apologizing, or making restitution personally. Similarly, credit for success is often given to individual hard work or talent, reinforcing both the privilege and burden of responsibility on each person. This perspective is tied to Protestant-influenced work ethic and the earlier break from viewing fortune or misfortune purely as fate or divine will. It's not that Westerners reject luck or systemic factors, but culturally, there is a bias toward acting as if one can and should control one's destiny through responsible action. For example, Western healthcare campaigns frequently appeal to personal responsibility for lifestyle, diet, exercise, in preventing disease. Western legal codes emphasize intent. Responsibility is linked to whether one intentionally or negligently did something, reflecting an assumption of rational agency. Even in politics, citizens are told they have responsibility to vote, to stay informed, to contribute to community, suggesting that each person's choices cumulatively shape society. Harkening back to the Greek citizen ideal and the Protestant idea of each soul's direct responsibility to God. Comparatively, in more collectivist cultures, responsibility is often seen as shared. Family or community might collectively take responsibility for members' behavior, and individuals may feel less solely accountable for success or failure, attributing more to destiny, divine will, or social conditions. In some traditional contexts, if someone fails, blame might be ascribed to bad luck or displeasing cosmic order rather than personal lapse. Conversely, Western culture tends to ask, "What could you have done differently?" This Western inclination drives continuous self-improvement, and learning from mistakes. It also influences policy. Western welfare systems, while providing support, often also incorporate expectations, job-seeking requirements for unemployment benefits, for instance, under the notion that individuals should strive to better their situation with help rather than remain passive. Personal responsibility in the West also means moral agency. Individuals are expected to discern right from wrong and bear responsibility if they harm others. Hence, things like the Nuremberg trials. Following orders was deemed insufficient excuse, establishing that individuals have personal moral responsibility even in hierarchical structures. This principle empowers civil disobedience as well. Western thought, Thoreau, Gandhi, influenced by Western liberalism, Martin Luther King Jr., holds that one has a responsibility to oppose unjust laws peacefully, taking personal accountability for that stance, accepting jail as part of demonstrating the higher moral law. On the everyday level, Western parents, schools, and self-help movements consistently teach taking ownership of one's life, e.g., time management skills, financial responsibility. Budgeting and not defaulting on debts is a moral duty in Western business culture, apologizing if one errs rather than saving face at all costs. These attitudes may not be uniquely Western, but the weight placed on them is distinctive. They contribute to Western cultures often being described as low context in anthropology. People say what they mean. Contracts spell out duties explicitly, rather than relying on implicit communal understandings. Each person signs on the dotted line and is expected to fulfill exactly their part. By emphasizing personal responsibility, Western civilization fosters initiative and accountability, but can also be demanding. Individuals can feel pressure or blame themselves for failures, even when larger forces are at play. Still, this trait has driven Westerners to be proactive in solving problems. The mindset, if something's wrong, I need to fix it or find a solution, rather than accepting it as beyond one's control. It also undergirds Western systems of justice and reward, aiming in principle to align outcomes with individuals' actions. In sum, Western civilization largely treats people as moral agents with control over their behavior, and therefore responsible for it, a stance linked with its legal codes, economic ethos, and philosophical traditions of individualism. Civic virtue and public service. Western civilization inherits from its Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian past a strong ideal of civic virtue. The notion that citizens should actively contribute to the public good and not merely pursue private interests. This tenet holds that freedom must be coupled with public service and community involvement to sustain a healthy society. From the earliest Western republics to modern democracies, the West has extolled those who devote themselves to community, whether through military service, holding public office, volunteering, or simply constructive participation in civic life. In classical antiquity, the Roman and Athenian ideal citizen was one who put the city-state's welfare above personal gain when duty called. The stories of Roman heroes like Cincinnatus, who left his farm to serve as dictator in a crisis, then relinquished power, resonated through Western history, inspiring later leaders. George Washington was likened to Cincinnatus for stepping down from power. The founders of the American Republic emphasized virtue among citizens and leaders, believing the success of self-governance depended on an informed, morally upright populace willing to sacrifice for the common good if needed. Early Americans served in volunteer militias, on juries, in town halls, habits that Tocqueville noted as the bedrock of American democracy. This ethic is visible in Western expectations that people will vote, obey fair laws, serve on juries, and even be willing to defend the nation. Conscription or volunteer military service has been common in many Western countries, reflecting the idea that defense of liberty is a shared civic responsibility. Western school curricula historically included civics or republican virtues, like the European emphasis on forming citoyens after the French Revolution, or American schools teaching about the Founding Fathers and civic duties. There is pride in public institutions like the Peace Corps or Teach for America, where citizens choose lower pay or hardship to serve others, a modern echo of older civic virtue ideals. This tenet also appears in the proliferation of civil society organizations and NGOs in the West, as discussed earlier. People often engage in community service, charity, or activism not for profit, but because they feel a duty to improve society. Philanthropy by wealthy Westerners, Carnegie building libraries, Gates funding global health, is often framed as giving back, an expectation in Western culture that success comes with responsibility to help others. Even Western corporate cultures encourage, quote, corporate social responsibility, another extension of the idea that all actors in society should consider the public interest. The concept of civic virtue complements Western individualism by ensuring it doesn't devolve into selfishness. It's the balance. Individuals pursue their happiness, but also recognize an obligation to community. Other cultures certainly value community, but the Western spin is volunteering and civic duty as chosen actions of free citizens, rather than mandated by caste, clan, or autocrat. For example, in some authoritarian systems, the state compels service, like forced campaigns, which is different from Western voluntary civic engagement, driven by personal conviction or societal norm. Western political discourse still frequently appeals to civic virtue. Politicians call for unity and sacrifice in crises, like asking citizens to ration or contribute during World War II or the COVID-19 pandemic. There is respect for professions seen as public service. Soldiers, firefighters, teachers, even career bureaucrats are often honored in Western societies for their service role. Memorial Day, public servant appreciation, etc. The Western ideal leader is one who serves, not rules. Hence terms like public servant for officials and an expectation of humility and accountability to the people. This traces back to Christian servant leadership and classical republican ideals combined. By fostering civic virtue, Western societies manage to have vibrant democracies, because democracy relies on citizens caring enough to participate and sometimes put community above narrow interest. Voter turnout, community meetings, volunteering in local organizations all reflect civic-mindedness. While modern life challenges this, some worry about apathy or individual consumerism overtaking civic engagement. Western nations actively encourage volunteerism and communal activities to keep this spirit alive. In essence, Western civilization doesn't see citizens as mere inhabitants, but as stakeholders in a common project. Freedom in the West was never meant to be isolation. It was freedom to collectively govern and improve society. This is why the West has continually reformed itself through citizen-led movements. People take ownership of their society's direction. The very word republic comes from Latin res publica, the public thing, indicating that what's public is everyone's concern. That mindset, that each person has a role in tending to the public realm, is a distinct and enduring feature of Western culture. It has ensured that rights come with responsibilities, and that liberty joins with fraternity, keeping Western societies both free and, ideally, cohesive and civically healthy. I just blank underscore blank. These 40 tenets, from the rule of law and democracy to individualism balanced by civic duty, collectively define the ethos of Western civilization. They arose over millennia of historical development, shaped by the legacies of Athens, Rome, Jerusalem, and the Enlightenment, and they distinguish the West's social, political, and moral landscape. Though not every Western society has perfectly lived up to each principle at all times, these core values have guided reforms and aspirations. In practice, they interact and reinforce one another. For instance, a free individual in the West is educated, mass education, to exercise reason, rationalism, and moral choice, participates in democratic governance, popular sovereignty under rule of law and equality, owns property and pursues enterprise, capitalism, yet also contributes to community, civic virtue, all while engaging in open debate, free speech, and critical thought, self-critique, to drive progress. This constellation of tenets has given Western civilization its particular dynamism, coherence, and global influence. In the 21st century, these Western-born principles have diffused widely. Many are now enshrined in international norms, yet they remain distinctive in their origin and the degree to which they continue to shape Western institutions and identity. By understanding these foundational tenets, we grasp not only what has made the West as it is, but also the ideals it strives to uphold in an ever-changing world. Sources. 1. Wikipedia. Western Values. Overview of core Western principles, liberty, democracy, etc., and their historical origins. 2. Wikipedia. Asian Values. Contrast between Western individualist values and communitarian values in some Asian societies, highlighting differences in emphasis on liberty versus order. 3. Joseph Henrich et al. The Puzzle of Monogamous Marriage. Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society B. 2012. Anthropological Analysis, noting that around 85% of recorded societies permitted polygamy, but Western norms enforced monogamy, with social benefits such as lower crime and more equal marriage opportunities. 4. Anna Ciampani, Top 5 Core Values of Western Societies, CEO WORLD Magazine 2021, discusses modern Western cultural values like individualism, personal responsibility, free enterprise, equality, and patriotism. 5. Niall Ferguson, Civilization, The West and the Rest, Penguin 2011, identifies killer apps of Western success: competition, science, property rights, medicine, consumerism, work ethic, and how they gave the West an edge. 6. Samuel P. Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations, Simon & Schuster, 1996, outlines unique features of Western civilization, such as separation of church and state, rule of law, social pluralism, individualism, in contrast to other cultural blocs. 7. Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, 1835, classic analysis of American society highlighting civic engagement, volunteerism, and the importance of associations in Western democracy. 8. Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, 1905, influential thesis linking Western work ethic and capitalist development to Protestant religious values emphasizing hard work, frugality, and vocation. 9. Francis Fukuyama, The Origins of Political Order, Farrar, Strauss, and Giroux, 2011, explores development of institutions like rule of law and accountable government, comparing Western trajectory, e.g., property rights, strong state balanced by law, with other regions. 10. Tom Holland, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, Basic Books, 2019, argues that many Western values, human dignity, moral equality, care for the weak, are rooted in the Christian legacy, even in secular guise. 11. Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, Viking 2018. Defense and celebration of Enlightenment-born Western values, reason, science, humanistic ethics, progress, with data on how these have improved human life. 12. Magna Carta, 1215. Iconic historical document establishing rule of law and certain rights in England, symbolizing the Western commitment to legal constraints on power and rights of subjects. 13. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, United Nations, 1948. Global Charter of Rights, largely influenced by Western liberal principles, drafted by Western leaders in aftermath of World War II, reflecting Western tenets of individual rights, equality, and freedom of thought, religion, and expression.